Close your eyes and picture a castle. What do you see? Torchlit halls with soaring stone arches. Knights in polished armor standing guard at heavy wooden doors. Tables laden with roasted meats and goblets of wine. Ladies in silk gowns descending spiral staircases, their jewels catching the firelight. Perhaps there's a king on a throne, or a jester entertaining the court, or monks illuminating manuscripts in a quiet tower room. This is the castle we all carry in our minds. This is the castle we've been taught to imagine. Every film, every storybook, and every historical drama has reinforced this same vision. When tourists visit castle ruins, the guidebooks fill in the gaps with descriptions of feasts and tournaments and royal intrigue. Museums reconstruct these spaces with mannequins in period costume, arranged in tableaux that feel both ancient and oddly familiar. The stones themselves seem to whisper of chivalry and romance and a simpler, more noble age. We stand in these empty halls, and we can almost hear the echoes of a vanished world. But here's what no one tells you. That world never existed. Not in the way you've been shown. Every castle you've ever seen is a lie. Not the stones, those are real. But everything else. A carefully constructed illusion designed to hide what actually happened inside these walls. The castle in your mind was built by Victorians who needed to believe their ancestors were noble and refined. It was reinforced by Hollywood directors who required dramatic backdrops for tales of honor and heroism. It was polished by tourism industries that understood romance sells better than reality. And it began centuries ago, when the very people who owned these goals commissioned artists and chroniclers to create flattering versions of their lives, versions that bore little resemblance to the truth. Layer upon layer of myth, each generation adding their own distortions, until the original reality became unrecognizable. The actual evidence tells a different story. Archaeological digs reveal details that never make it into the guidebooks. Historical records, when examined closely, contradict almost everything popular culture has taught us. Building plans show purposes for rooms that don't match their official explanations. Chemical analysis of medieval floors uncovers activities no one wants to discuss. The physical spaces themselves, when studied without romantic prejudice, reveal functions that shatter our comfortable assumptions. Real castles were not frozen moments of medieval pageantry. They were living, evolving spaces packed with hundreds, sometimes thousands, of ordinary people. Servants and soldiers, craftsmen and laborers, merchants and prisoners, along with their families and children and animals. These walls contained births and deaths, illnesses and injuries, hunger and exhaustion, and the grinding reality of survival in a world far harsher than we imagine. The nobles we focus on were a tiny minority, often absent, while the real life of the castle happened in spaces we're never shown and involved people whose names we'll never know. And here's the uncomfortable question. Why don't we know their stories? It's not simply that time erased them. Records existed. Physical evidence remained. But someone made decisions about what to preserve and what to forget. Someone chose which version of castle life would be passed down through history. The erasure was systematic, deliberate, and almost completely successful. We're left with fragments, scratches on walls that hint at desperate messages, stains on stone that suggest violence, architectural oddities that don't fit the official narrative, documents that survive by accident, revealing glimpses of a reality that powerful people wanted buried. And if you know where to look, if you're willing to question everything you've been taught, these fragments begin to form a pattern. They point toward an entirely different understanding of what castles actually were, who really lived in them, and what happened in the spaces between the grand halls and the romantic legends. The stones remember, even when we've been taught to forget. And what they remember changes everything. Stand in any castle courtyard and look up at the walls surrounding you. Not at the towers or the battlements or the decorative elements that draw your eye. Look at the stone itself. Really look. You'll begin to notice things that don't make sense. A faint rectangular outline where the mortar is slightly different in color. An arch that frames nothing but solid stone. A window on the third floor with no corresponding window on the floor below. Steps that climb halfway up a wall and then simply end, leading nowhere. These aren't design quirks or architectural flourishes. They're scars, evidence of alteration. Someone bricked up doorways. Someone sealed passages. Someone went to considerable effort to hide where these openings originally led. And they did it so thoroughly that most visitors never noticed the traces left behind. Look closely at any castle wall, and you'll see the outlines of doorways that lead nowhere. Windows that open to solid stone, and staircases that simply stop. Someone went to great effort to hide where these passages originally led. And once you start seeing these anomalies, you can't stop. They're everywhere. Every castle contains them. Modifications layered upon modifications. Each generation erasing parts of what came before. Until the original layout becomes almost impossible to reconstruct. Run your hand along ancient stonework, and you'll feel grooves where metal fixtures once attached. Hinges for doors that no longer exist. Brackets for beams that were removed centuries ago. The stone remembers the weight of structures that official histories never mention. On floors worn smooth by countless footsteps, the traffic patterns tell stories that contradict the supposed function of rooms. Deep grooves lead toward walls where no doors now exist. Smooth paths curve around spaces that floor plans show as empty. People moved through these buildings in ways that make no sense according to our current understanding of castle layout. Architects have a term for this: palimpsest architecture. Like ancient manuscripts, where one text was scraped away so the parchment could be reused for another, castles are buildings that have been written over again and again. But just as scholars can sometimes recover the erased text beneath, careful examination of castle walls reveals layers of earlier construction. Buildings that once stood against outer walls leave discoloration patterns in the stone. Roof lines are visible as lines of different weathering. Entire wings that were demolished still cast their shadow in the archaeological record. Castles weren't static. They expanded when wealth increased, contracted during hard times, and transformed completely as military needs changed and social structures evolved. A great hall might become a stable. A chapel might be converted to storage. Defensive walls might be lowered and turned into garden boundaries. Entire floors could be added or removed. The medieval castle that tourists visit today might be unrecognizable to someone who lived in the same structure 2 centuries earlier. And sometimes, modern technology reveals just how much has been hidden. In France, ground-penetrating radar scanned beneath a famous Loire Valley castle and discovered an entire basement level that appeared on no historical plan, no architectural survey, no tourist map. The underground chambers had been deliberately filled in with rubble and sealed. No document explained why. In Germany, conservators working on a fortress removed layers of Victorian-era restoration plaster and exposed medieval graffiti scratched into stone by the people who actually lived there. Their words contradicted every official chronicle. In Wales, close examination of a castle's stone walls revealed timber impressions, the negative space left by wooden structures that once leaned against the fortification. Massive wooden buildings, large enough to house dozens of people, that existed for decades or centuries, but were never mentioned in any surviving document. The architecture itself is a witness. The stones testify to spaces that were meant to be forgotten, and every blocked passage, every sealed doorway, every vanished staircase raises the same question. What happened in these spaces that someone wanted erased from history? More importantly, whose activities took place there, whose lives unfolded in rooms that now exist only as outlines in old stone? The walls know. And they're still talking, if you learn their language. Imagine standing in the great hall of a medieval castle on a winter evening in the year 1347. The space around you would be crowded. Servants carrying platters, guards stationed at doorways, musicians in the gallery, children of various households running between tables, craftsmen waiting to speak with the steward about supplies, kitchen staff passing through with bread and ale, messengers arriving with news, dogs weaving through legs searching for scraps. At any given moment, you'd be surrounded by dozens of people, the hall alive with movement and noise and the complexity of a functioning household. Now read the historical chronicle from that same evening. You'll find perhaps 3 names mentioned. The lord who hosted the gathering, a visiting bishop, maybe a knight of some importance. Everyone else, all those people you would have seen and heard and brushed past in the crowded hall, simply doesn't exist in the written record. If you stood in a medieval castle's great hall, you'd be surrounded by people. But if you read the historical records from that exact moment, you'd think the room was nearly empty. Where did everyone go? The answer is disturbing. They were never there to begin with, at least not according to those who kept records. A large castle might house 200 to 500 people at any given time. Yet surviving documents from that same period might name only 10 or 15 individuals. The rest left almost no trace. No birth records, no death notices, no marriage documents, no wills, no legal disputes bearing their names. They move through history like ghosts, essential to the castle's operation, but beneath the threshold of documentation. For every noble person whose life was carefully chronicled, there were 20 to 50 others whose existence was considered too insignificant to record. Servants who woke before dawn to light fires. Craftspeople who maintained weapons, repaired walls, and shoed horses. Soldiers who stood watch through cold nights. Laundresses who scrubbed linens in freezing water. Cooks who prepared meals for hundreds. Stable hands, blacksmiths, carpenters, masons, wet nurses, midwives, herbalists, entertainers, messengers, scribes, and their families, wives, husbands, children, elderly parents, all living within the castle walls, all invisible to history. This absence isn't accidental. Record-keeping was expensive, time-consuming, and reserved for those who mattered in legal and financial terms. Birth records existed for children who might inherit property or titles. Death records for those whose estates needed settling. marriage documents for unions that transferred wealth or forged political alliances. Everyone else simply didn't register. They were born, lived, and died without ever entering the documentary record that historians rely on centuries later. The few records that do acknowledge this hidden population treat them as categories rather than individuals. Account books list expenses for servants, a single line item covering dozens of people. Archaeological excavations reveal sleeping quarters that could house 20 or 30 workers, but no names attached to those spaces. Occasionally, tadtachite, a document survives that inadvertently reveals the scale. A provision list showing food purchased for 80 people. A payroll fragment mentioning 40 soldiers. A building account noting space for staff and their families. The evidence is everywhere once you look for it. Wear patterns on back staircases used by servants making hundreds of trips daily. Large communal spaces with no official function. Clearly designed for people who didn't merit individual chambers. Cooking facilities capable of feeding hundreds. But the people themselves remain nameless, faceless, reduced to the archaeological shadow of their labor. This erasure wasn't about forgetting. It was about these lives never being considered worth remembering in the first place. They were the infrastructure of castle life, as essential and invisible as the wells and sewers, and just as unlikely to be commemorated. The stones they walked on remain. The doorways they passed through still stand. But the people themselves vanished from history the moment they died, as if they had never existed at all. And yet they did exist. Hundreds of them. Thousands across all the castles of medieval Europe. An entire hidden population whose labor made castle life possible, whose stories filled these halls, whose presence is written into the architecture itself even when their names are lost forever. Walk through any castle on a guided tour, and you'll follow a carefully planned route. Great hall to dining room to chapel to bedchamber. The path feels natural, logical, as if this is simply how the building flows. But you're being shown a curated experience. You're walking through what was meant to be seen, while an entire parallel architecture gists just beyond your vision, designed specifically to remain hidden. Every castle contains a ghost castle, a second complete structure of passages, rooms, and staircases that you're not supposed to see. Most tourists walk right past the hidden doors without ever knowing they're there. These aren't secret passages in the romantic sense, built for escapes and intrigue. There's something far more mundane and revealing, the working infrastructure of an elaborate illusion. Medieval and early modern castles were deliberately designed as two castles occupying the same physical space. There was the front stage, the grand halls where power was performed, where guests were received, where nobles displayed their wealth and authority. And there was the backstage, the service corridors where work happened, where food was prepared, where servants slept and supplies were stored. These two worlds existed in the same structure, but were kept meticulously separate through architectural design. The separation was total. Servants used completely different circulation systems than nobles. Hidden staircases spiraled within thick walls, allowing staff to move between floors without ever entering the main rooms. Service corridors ran parallel to formal hallways, accessible only through doors disguised as wooden paneling or hidden behind tapestries. A servant could traverse the entire length of a castle without once setting foot in the spaces used by the family and their guests. Consider how meals appeared in the Great Hall. Nobles saw a finished presentation, platters of food arriving at perfect temperature, wine appearing in goblets, tables cleared between courses. They didn't see the kitchen located in a separate building 50 meters away, connected by an underground passage so cooking smoke and smells wouldn't contaminate the main structure. They didn't see servants running through that tunnel carrying heavy trays, or the dumbwaiter systems that lifted food through multiple floors, or the serving hatches that allowed plates to be passed through walls so staff remained invisible even during the moment of delivery. The architecture created the illusion of effortless luxury. Food materialized. Fires were always lit, but no one ever saw them being tended. Chambers were clean, but cleaning never seemed to happen. Waste disappeared. Fresh linens appeared. Dozens of tasks essential to comfortable living occurred constantly. Yet noble inhabitants moved through spaces that seemed to function by magic rather than labor. But this separation served purposes beyond mere convenience. It was a physical manifestation of social hierarchy, built into the very bones of the structure. When servants could only access certain areas through hidden passages, when their circulation patterns never intersected with those of the nobility, the architecture itself enforced the idea that these were fundamentally different categories of human beings, not meant to occupy the same spaces. The building made inequality tangible. This design also enabled surveillance and control. Service corridors were narrow, monitored and limited. Staff movements could be tracked and restricted. There were proper routes and improper routes, authorized passages and forbidden ones. The architecture channeled and constrained the hidden population, making it difficult for servants to go anywhere they weren't supposed to be, or to gather in groups outside designated areas. The castle's layout was a control system. Meanwhile, the noble family lived in a carefully curated bubble, insulated from the reality of the labor supporting them. They could pretend that their lifestyle was natural rather than constructed, that their comfort required no particular effort or cost, that the dozens of people working around them simply didn't exist. The architecture made this delusion architecturally possible. When you tour a castle today, you're almost always walking through only the front stage. The grand staterooms are preserved and displayed. But the working castle, the servants' stairs, the storage cellars, the sleeping quarters, the service passages, these remain closed to visitors, or have been demolished entirely, or exist but are labeled staff only without explanation. You see half a building and mistake it for the whole. The ghost castle is still there, though, if you know where to look. Those narrow doors that seem oddly placed, those staircases that appear to lead nowhere, those rooms marked private on the tour map. Behind the walls you're allowed to see lies the architecture that made the visible castle possible. The servants' castle, the working castle, the real castle. And understanding that this dual structure existed changes everything about how we interpret these buildings. Because the question becomes, what else was deliberately hidden? If the architecture itself was designed to conceal, what did those concealed spaces contain? And who decided what would be shown and what would remain forever in the shadows? In 1850, workers renovating a Scottish castle broke through what they thought was a solid wall. Behind it, they found a furnished room, a skeleton seated at a table, and a letter dated 1586. The room had been sealed for 264 years, with someone still inside. The letter was never made public, and the official records simply note that the chamber was discovered and subsequently closed again for reasons of family privacy. Whatever that room contained, whatever that letter said, someone decided it should remain secret even after nearly 3 centuries. This wasn't unusual. Castles are filled with spaces designed to disappear. Some were simple hidden doors, engineered with remarkable sophistication. Jib doors were cut so precisely into wood paneling that their seams vanished when closed. No hinges showed on the visible side. No handles betrayed their presence. The door became indistinguishable from the wall, and unless you knew exactly where to press, you'd never find it. Other entrances hid behind bookcases mounted on pivoting frames, behind fireplaces with movable back panels, or beneath floorboards lifted by concealed mechanisms. The engineering required was surprisingly complex. Rotating wall sections needed counterweight systems hidden within the castle's structure so they could be moved with minimal effort. Sliding panels ran on tracks carved into stone, lubricated with animal fat to ensure silent operation. Trap doors required springs or counterbalances to prevent them from slamming shut and revealing their location through sound. These weren't crude constructions. They were precision mechanisms, maintained and adjusted, sometimes incorporating lock systems that could only be opened from one side. But hidden doors were just the beginning. Many castles contained false walls. Partition walls built a few feet in front of actual exterior or interior walls, creating narrow voids between them. These gaps were just wide enough for a person to move through sideways. From inside these voids, you could traverse entire sections of the castle, passing behind rooms where people talked, argued, and made plans, never knowing they were being overheard. Small holes drilled through the inner wall at eye-level provided sight lines. The hidden observer could watch and listen, gathering information, monitoring loyalty, or satisfying paranoia. After the Reformation in England, these architectural tricks became matters of survival. Catholic families built priest holes, hidden chambers where clergy could hide during raids. These spaces were cramped, airless, often built into chimneys or beneath staircases, sometimes no larger than a coffin standing upright. Men hid in these spaces for days, breathing through tiny ventilation holes, trying not to move or cough while soldiers searched the rooms around them. Some priest holes are still being discovered today, nearly 500 years after they were sealed. Archaeological evidence suggests many of these features weren't part of original construction. They were added during later renovations, implying that castle residents developed increasing needs for secrecy as time passed. Walls that appear medieval on both sides sometimes contain Victorian-era voids. This means someone in the 1800s felt compelled to create hidden passages in a building already centuries old. What changed? What new secrets required architectural concealment? Restoration projects keep uncovering sealed chambers, rooms that weren't simply forgotten but deliberately closed off. Masons bricked up doorways, plasterers covered the seams, and the spaces vanished from floor plans. Sometimes these rooms still contain objects, furniture, personal items, documents. In one German castle, renovators found a sealed chamber containing dozens of painted portraits, all showing the same woman's face, but damaged in specific ways. Eyes scratched out, throat slashed in the paint. No record explains who she was or why her images were hidden away. Theories multiply about the purposes of these hidden spaces. Some held valuables during times of war or political instability. Some enabled affairs or forbidden relationships to occur beyond the surveillance of the household. Some sheltered religious practices that had become illegal. Some may have been torture chambers or prisons where people could be held beyond any legal oversight. And some might have been simply about privacy, creating small spaces where castle residents could exist beyond the constant observation of communal medieval life. But here's the unsettling reality. We only know about the hidden spaces that have been found. How many remain concealed, their entrances so perfectly disguised that modern researchers walk past them daily? How many sealed chambers still wait behind walls that no one has thought to examine? And what did the people who created these spaces want, hidden badly enough to literally wall it away from the world? The castles themselves won't tell us. They keep their secrets. In a medieval castle, your physical location revealed your social status with such precision that you could determine someone's exact rank in the household hierarchy just by seeing which door they were allowed to walk through. This wasn't metaphorical. The castle's architecture was a three-dimensional map of power, with every corridor, doorway, and chamber representing a specific level of access that corresponded directly to social rank. Space itself was a language of hierarchy, and everyone who lived or visited understood how to read it. The system worked through concentric zones of exclusivity, like rings of increasing privacy and power. The outermost courtyard was accessible to virtually anyone. Merchants delivering goods, peasants bringing complaints, travelers seeking shelter. This was public space, where the castle interfaced with the outside world. Move inward through the gates, and you reached the middle courts, where only those with legitimate business or explicit permission could enter. Tradespeople with contracts, lower-ranking officials, messengers from other nobles. These areas required justification for your presence. Pass through another set of doors, and you entered the inner halls, spaces restricted to actual members of the household, whether family, permanent staff, or long-term guests. Simply being allowed in these rooms marked you as belonging to the castle's inner circle. But even here, gradations existed. Certain halls were more restricted than others. Some chambers required specific invitations, and at the very center of this spatial hierarchy sat the Lord's private apartments, the ultimate inner sanctum where only the most trusted advisors, body servants, and family members could enter. The Lord's bedchamber functioned as the Holy of Holies. Access to this space meant you held genuine power and trust. Ministers of state might be received there for confidential discussions. Personal servants might enter to dress the Lord or tend to intimate needs. A handful of favorites might be invited for private conversations that shaped the castle's political direction. Everyone else, no matter their rank outside, remained excluded. The bedroom was the geographic center of power, and proximity to it measured influence with mathematical precision. This spatial arrangement had profound political implications. When a noble visitor was escorted deep into the private chambers for an audience, everyone who saw them pass through those restricted doors understood the message. This person has favor, access, importance. Conversely, being stopped at an outer hall, being made to wait in public spaces, being denied entry beyond certain points, these were public humiliations, visible demonstrations that you lacked status or had fallen from grace. The castle's architecture made favor visible and quantifiable. Castle residents developed acute sensitivity to these spatial politics. You learned which doors you could open without asking and which required permission. You understood which corridors you could use as shortcuts and which would result in harsh reprimands if you were caught there without cause. Your daily movement through the castle traced the boundaries of your social position. Servants knew their routes. Nobles knew their privileges, and everyone watched everyone else, noting who went where and with whose permission. This created a comprehensive surveillance system. The strategic placement of guards at key transition points meant that movement between zones was observed and controlled. Servants working throughout the castle formed an unintentional network of witnesses, noting comings and goings as part of their awareness of the household's rhythms. Those few individuals with access to hidden passages, whether by design or discovery, gained an enormous advantage, able to move unseen, to gather information, to bypass the normal checkpoints that monitored everyone else's movements. The architecture itself became a tool of governance. You didn't need explicit rules about who could go where when the building's design made certain paths accessible and others physically blocked. You didn't need constant verbal reminders of hierarchy when every movement through space reinforced your position within it. The castle taught its inhabitants their place simply by limiting or granting access to physical locations. And this system worked so effectively that it never really ended. Walk through a modern corporate headquarters and you'll find the same principles. Open lobby accessible to anyone, secured floors requiring key cards, executive suites behind additional locked doors, and the CEO's office in the most protected, inaccessible location. Government buildings, museums, universities, all use space to denote rank and control access. We've inherited the castle's spatial logic, still encoding power relationships into architecture centuries after the last castle was built. But here's what this means for understanding castle history. This carefully controlled geography of power applied only to those who were supposed to be seen, those whose movements mattered politically. There was another population moving through these spaces on completely different terms, using different doors, following different rules, occupying the negative space between the zones of power. The invisible majority who made the castle function, but were never meant to register in the spatial hierarchy at all. And it's their world, the hidden geography beneath the geography of power, that we're finally ready to explore. The castle day began in darkness, hours before the sun touched the horizon. While nobles slept behind thick curtains in their chambers, an entire hidden population was already at work, moving through cold corridors by candlelight, beginning the invisible labor that would create the illusion of effortless luxury. Servants assigned to the fireplaces rose first, sometimes as early as 4 a.m. during winter. They moved through the castle carrying kindling and logs, entering bedchambers where people still slept, kneeling at cold hearths to coax flames from embers. Every fire had to be lit and burning steadily before the room's occupants woke, so nobles would open their eyes to warmth and never consider who had provided it. The servant had to work silently, breathing the smoke, feeling the heat scorch their hands and face, then disappear before being noticed. Water carriers made dozens of trips up narrow staircases, hauling heavy buckets from wells or cisterns to fill washing basins in chambers throughout the castle. A single noble's morning washing routine might require 30 gallons of water, all of it carried by hand, one bucket at a time, up flights of stone steps. Their arms and backs bore the cost of this daily repetition, muscles and joints deteriorating years before their time. In the bedchambers, Other servants performed the most degrading tasks. Chamber pots had to be emptied, their contents carried through the castle to disposal points, the vessels cleaned and returned before they were needed again. This work was assigned to the lowest ranking servants, often young girls who had no power to refuse. The smell, the humiliation, the constant reminder of their position in the household hierarchy, all part of the job that had to be done before nobles even stepped out of bed. Meanwhile, in the stables, grooms had already spent 2 hours feeding horses, mucking stalls, checking animals for injuries or illness, and preparing mounts for the day's activities. By the time a noble arrived to ride, the horse would be groomed to perfection, tack polished, everything ready. The nobles saw only the finished result, never the labor that began while they were still asleep. Kitchen work started even earlier. Fires in cooking hearths had to be brought up to temperature, a process that could take an hour. Bread needed kneading and baking. Meat required butchering. Vegetables had to be cleaned and chopped. By the time breakfast was served, kitchen staff had been working in stifling heat for 4 or 5 hours, preparing food for dozens or hundreds, while simultaneously cleaning the dishes, pots, and utensils from the previous day's meals. Scullery workers scrubbed in water that left their hands raw and cracked. Their skin aged beyond their years. All of this labor was carefully timed to occur either before nobles woke or in spaces nobles never visited. The work had to be invisible. Candles appeared lit, rooms were always warm. Food materialized at appropriate times. Everything was perpetually clean. The castle seemed to maintain itself, to function through some natural order rather than through the exhausting physical work of hundreds of people. A medieval noble might believe they lived in a castle of 50 people. A servant knew the real number was close to 300. One group lived in the castle. The other group was the castle, the living machinery that made everything work. The physical toll was measurable. Archaeological analysis of servant skeletons shows repetitive stress injuries consistent with specific tasks. Damaged knees from kneeling at hearths, deteriorated spine discs from carrying heavy loads, worn shoulder joints from scrubbing and lifting. Servants died younger than nobles, their bodies used up by decades of labor that began in childhood and continued until they were no longer physically capable. But the emotional cost may have been worse. Servants were required to be functionally invisible, to show no personality or individual identity while working. They had to pretend not to hear private conversations, not to see intimate moments, not to react to anything that happened in their presence. If something went wrong, a fire not lit properly, water spilled, food delayed, they received immediate blame. When everything functioned perfectly, they received no credit. Their success meant no one noticed they existed. This was the price of castle luxury. Every comfortable moment a noble experienced had been constructed through hours of invisible human labor, performed by people whose names we'll never know, whose faces were never painted, whose lives were never considered worth recording. They were the foundation upon which the entire castle society rested. Yet they remained the most forgotten people in history, and they had to sleep somewhere. They had to eat. They had to exist in physical space, even when that existence wasn't acknowledged. So where exactly did these hundreds of invisible people live within the castle walls? While a noble family of 5 occupied a suite of 8 luxurious rooms, the 30 servants who maintained their lifestyle shared a single drafty attic space. But here's the strange part. The servants' area covered more total square footage. Where was all that space going? The answer reveals everything about how castle society valued different categories of human beings. Servant quarters were tucked into whatever spaces the castle's primary architecture left available. Above kitchens, where the heat from cooking fires below made summer nights unbearable and filled the air with smoke and food smells. In towers, where stone walls provided no insulation against winter cold and wind howled through gaps in the shutters. In basement levels, where dampness seeped through walls and daylight never penetrated. In converted storage rooms, former armories, and modified guard posts. Servants lived in the architectural leftovers, the spaces too uncomfortable or inconvenient for anyone with the power to refuse them. These weren't individual accommodations. A typical servant room housed anywhere from 4 to 20 people, sleeping on straw mattresses laid directly on floors or on simple wooden platforms built along walls. The straw was replaced periodically when it became too compressed or infested. But between replacements, it grew thin and offered little cushioning against hard surfaces. Some servants slept on pallets, basic fabric sacks stuffed with straw or rags, that could be rolled up during the day to create minimal floor space for other activities. Privacy simply didn't exist. You slept in a room with a dozen others. You changed clothes in front of them. You were sick in front of them. You cried, argued, and dealt with monthly bleeding in front of them. Your belongings fit into a single wooden chest, if you owned one, which doubled as a bench or table when not storing your few possessions. Most servants owned 2 sets of clothing, maybe a spare pair of shoes, a few personal items. Everything you had could be seen and accessed by everyone who shared your space. Male and female servants were theoretically housed in separate areas, often on different floors or in different wings. The separation was meant to prevent relationships and maintain moral order. But enforcement varied widely depending on how strictly the household steward supervised the staff. Relationships between servants were common despite official prohibitions. Some castles tolerated them, others punished them harshly. Either way, servants found ways to be together, because they were human beings, living in close proximity under difficult conditions, and companionship was one of the few comforts available. Servant quarters were the last spaces to receive updates or maintenance. Noble apartments might be renovated with new windows, better heating systems, and modern furnishings. But servant areas remained essentially medieval in design and comfort well into later centuries. If a roof leaked, it was repaired in the family's wing first. If cold was a problem, nobles got additional fireplaces while servants received extra blankets, if anything. The discrepancy in living standards wasn't accidental, it was policy. Archaeological excavations of servant areas reveal the poverty of their possessions. Simple pottery for eating and drinking, minimal personal items. Evidence of activities during precious free time. Mending worn clothes, playing dice or card games, carving small wooden objects. The material culture of servant quarters shows lives focused on survival and basic comfort, with few resources for anything beyond necessity. Within the servant hierarchy, some had it marginally better. Stewards, ladies' maids, master cooks, and other high-ranking servants might be granted small private rooms, perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet, barely large enough for a bed and a chest, but offering the luxury of solitude. Meanwhile, scullery maids, stable boys, laundry workers, and other low-ranking servants endured the worst conditions. The most crowded rooms, the dampest basements, the spaces farthest from heat sources. Seasonal and temporary workers had no permanent accommodations at all. During harvest, or when the castle hosted large gatherings requiring extra staff, additional workers slept in haylofts, storage rooms cleared temporarily for bedding, or anywhere a body could fit. Some slept in the great hall after nobles had retired, their pallets spread across the floor and rolled up again before dawn. Every day, servants experienced a jarring contrast. They worked in grand spaces, sweeping marble floors, polishing fine furniture, serving meals in elegant dining halls, tending to beautiful chambers filled with luxury goods. Then they retreated to their cramped, uncomfortable quarters, where dozens of exhausted people competed for space, warmth, and a few hours of rest before the cycle began again. The castle contained two completely different realities, and servants moved between them daily, maintaining one world while barely surviving in the other. But poor living conditions were just one mechanism of control. Servants also lived under constant surveillance, strict behavioral codes, and the ever-present threat of harsh discipline for even minor infractions. Every castle servant lived under two sets of laws. One was the law of the land, which theoretically applied to everyone. The other was household law, a parallel legal system that governed their every waking moment and operated entirely at the discretion of their employers. Household ordinances were formal documents, sometimes running dozens of pages, that specified servants' duties and behaviors in exhaustive detail. These weren't simple job descriptions. They controlled when you woke, how you dressed, what routes you walked through the castle, how you spoke, where you looked when addressing superiors, what you ate, when you could leave the grounds, and whom you could associate with. Some ordinances specified that servants should move through the gaol quietly and without notice, essentially demanding invisibility. Others required servants to avert their eyes when nobles passed, to speak only when spoken to, and to pretend they heard and saw nothing of their employer's private affairs. Breaking these rules triggered swift consequences. Physical punishment was the most common enforcement mechanism, and it was entirely legal. A servant could be beaten for tardiness, for speaking out of turn, for failing to complete tasks properly, or simply for displaying an attitude their supervisor considered improper. The beatings were casual, routine, administered by stewards or senior servants acting on behalf of the household's authority. No trial was required. No appeal was possible. Financial penalties added another layer of control. Servants earned minimal wages to begin with, often just a few shillings per month plus room and board. Fines for infractions could consume weeks or months of earnings. A broken dish, a scorched garment during laundering, a task completed too slowly, all could result in wage deductions. Some servants ended up perpetually in debt to their employers, working essentially for free while trying to pay off accumulated fines. Castle household books reveal punishments recorded in the same casual manner as expenses for candles and firewood. One entry reads, "To discipline maid for impudence, 3 shillings. To replace maid who died from discipline, 1 shilling. The replacement cost less than the punishment. The maid's name wasn't recorded. The nature of her impudence wasn't explained. She existed in the historical record only as a line item, a minor expense, a problem solved. Public humiliation served as both punishment and warning. Servants could be placed in stocks in the courtyard, their offense announced to the entire household. They could be stripped of better positions and demoted to the lowest tasks. A lady's maid reduced to emptying chamber pots. A footman sent to muck stables. These demotions were deliberately public, designed to shame the individual and remind other servants of the consequences of disobedience. But the most devastating punishment was dismissal without a character reference. A character was a letter from your previous employer attesting to your honesty, reliability, and competence. Without one, finding new employment was nearly impossible. This system gave employers extraordinary power. They could effectively destroy a servant's livelihood by simply refusing to write a positive reference, and the threat of this outcome kept servants compliant even in situations of abuse or exploitation. Documented examples reveal the arbitrary nature of these punishments. A kitchen maid received 10 lashes for dropping a serving dish that chipped. A groom forfeited an entire month's wages because a horse under his care went lame, though the lameness resulted from a stone bruise that could have happened to any rider. A footman was dismissed immediately and without reference for being discovered in a female servant's sleeping quarters, even though they were engaged to be married with the full knowledge of other servants. The rules were enforced selectively, their severity depending on the mood of the enforcer and the status of the accused. Informal control systems operated alongside official ones. Senior servants enforced discipline on junior servants, creating a hierarchy of authority that extended the castle's power structure down to its lowest levels. A head housekeeper might be as feared by junior maids as the lady of the house. A master groom could make stable boys' lives miserable through endless small cruelties that never rose to the level of official punishment, but were no less effective for that. Gossip and reputation networks among servants created another enforcement mechanism. Your standing with other servants could determine whether you received help during difficult moments or were left to struggle alone. Information circulated quickly through the servant population. Who was trustworthy? Who was a spy for the masters? Who could be approached for small favors? Who would betray you to curry favor with superiors? Some servants gained protection through patronage, aligning themselves with particular nobles or senior servants who would shield them from the worst abuses. These relationships required loyalty and often involved performing additional, unspoken duties in exchange for protection. The system created factions within the servant population, competing loyalties, and complex politics that could be as intricate as the noble intrigues happening in the castle's public spaces. Yet servants weren't merely passive victims of this control system. They developed their own underground societies. Secret relationships flourished despite prohibitions. Private financial arrangements allowed servants to loan money to each other, pool resources, and create safety nets beyond official channels. Networks of mutual aid emerged, where servants protected each other, shared information, and found ways to resist or subvert the most oppressive rules without getting caught. These shadow societies operated in physical spaces as well as social ones, specific locations where servants could gather away from supervision, where rules could be bent if not broken, where resistance took form. And it's these spaces, deliberately hidden and officially denied, that reveal how servants maintained their humanity despite systematic attempts to reduce them to nothing more than functional tools of the castle's operation. Medieval documents from a castle in Yorkshire describe a brewhouse producing 300 gallons of ale weekly for household consumption. Modern architectural surveys of that same castle show no building large enough or properly configured to serve that function. For decades, historians assumed the documents exaggerated or that brewhouse meant something different than we understand. But recent archaeological excavations proved the documents were precisely accurate. An entire substantial building had vanished, deliberately demolished in the 1800s when Victorian owners decided its presence ruined the romantic medieval aesthetic they wanted to project. The brewhouse existed. History just chose to erase it. This wasn't unusual. Castles contained vast networks of working spaces essential to their operation. Yet these spaces have been systematically excluded from architectural tours, historical paintings, and romantic descriptions. Brewhouses, bakeries, butcheries, laundries, dairies, chandleries, workshops, smithies, tanneries, and dozens of different storage rooms once occupied significant portions of castle grounds. They were the actual economic heart of these structures. But you won't find them in the castle history you were taught. These utility spaces were typically located in outer courtyards or connected to the main castle through service passages that kept their noise, smells, and visual evidence far from noble living areas. The brewhouse required massive copper kettles for boiling, fermentation vessels, cooling troughs, and storage for barrels and ingredients. A single castle might brew thousands of gallons monthly, since ale was safer to drink than water, and consumed by everyone from nobles to stable boys. The heat, the smell of fermenting grain, the constant labor of stirring and monitoring, all of this happened in buildings substantial enough to house multiple workers, but invisible to the castle's official identity. Bakeries operated similar scales. Castle ovens were enormous, capable of baking dozens of loaves simultaneously. The heat was punishing. Bakers worked through the night so fresh bread would be available by morning. Their labor timed to the rhythms of consumption rather than daylight. These weren't small kitchen ovens. They were industrial-scale operations, requiring dedicated buildings with proper ventilation, fuel storage, and space for the continuous process of mixing, kneading, proofing, and baking that fed hundreds of people daily. Butcheries and game preparation rooms handled the slaughter and processing of animals. This work was bloody, messy, and required specialized knowledge to butcher efficiently and preserve meat through salting, smoking, or other methods. The spaces needed drainage, water access, hanging racks, and separation from other food preparation areas. No romantic castle painting shows these rooms, because they contradicted the sanitized version of medieval life that later generations wanted to believe in. Laundries dealt with the endless problem of keeping clothes, linens, and table coverings clean in an era before running water or modern soap. Large cauldrons heated water to near boiling. Workers scrubbed fabrics against stones or wooden boards, using harsh lye soaps that destroyed their hands. Drying rooms required space and ventilation. The physical toll on laundry workers was severe, yet the work was constant and essential. A single feast might generate hundreds of items needing washing. These spaces were erased from castle history for multiple reasons. Victorian restorers considered them aesthetically incompatible with their romantic medieval vision and demolished them to create lawn spaces or gardens. Chroniclers and artists of earlier eras simply didn't depict them because they were considered mundane, not worthy of attention compared to great halls and chapels. When castles were converted to museums or tourist attractions, these working spaces were often the first areas repurposed or destroyed because they seemed less historically significant than the performance spaces where nobility had lived. But archaeological evidence keeps proving their existence and scale. A chateau in France revealed an entire underground complex of food preparation and storage vaults, discovered only when ground-penetrating radar was used for an unrelated survey. An English castle underwent thermal imaging that exposed the locations of sealed ovens and kilns built into walls that had been plastered over during renovations. A German fortress showed unusual soil composition in specific areas. Chemical analysis revealed former tanneries and dye works that had left permanent traces in the earth, despite buildings being long demolished. Castle account books referenced these spaces constantly and named the specialists who worked in them: master brewers, head bakers, chandlers who made candles, coopers who built barrels, soap makers, blacksmiths, and dozens of other skilled craftspeople. These weren't occasional workers, but permanent staff with specific expertise, operating dedicated facilities that represented massive capital investment. Understanding castles requires reconstructing these vanished spaces. They weren't peripheral, they were central to castle function. These structures represented complete economic units capable of producing almost everything needed for daily life, from food to tools to clothing to weapons. The castle was factory, farm, and fortress combined. But some rooms vanished for different reasons entirely. Tour guides call it the Lord's private meditation chamber. The carved wooden benches suggest quiet contemplation. The small altar in the corner reinforces the spiritual narrative. But the iron rings embedded in the stone floor tell a different story entirely. They're spaced exactly the right distance apart for shackling a person's wrists and ankles. The Lord was meditating on something very specific: how to make prisoners talk. This room, like dozens of others across Europe's castles, has been strategically renamed. Its original purpose became inconvenient or embarrassing to later generations, so the designation changed. The physical space remained, but its identity was rewritten, and most visitors never questioned the official story presented on plaques and in guidebooks. The most common examples are garderobe towers at Tars. Medieval castles contained sophisticated waste disposal systems, small chambers with stone seats built into thick walls, positioned over vertical shafts that carried human waste down to cesspits or directly into moats. These were the castle's toilets, essential and used daily by everyone from nobles to servants. But Victorian sensibilities found such frank acknowledgement of bodily functions distasteful. So these spaces were romantically renamed dressing rooms, or powder rooms, or retiring chambers. The architectural evidence remains obvious. The chutes, the drains, the ventilation systems designed, though, to minimize odor. But tour guides often skip over these details or use euphemisms that obscure the room's actual function. Storage rooms present another pattern of deliberate obfuscation. Many castles contain small chambers in basements or towers, officially designated as storage for linens or provisions. But their features tell different stories. Floor rings for attaching chains, unusually heavy doors with external locks and viewing slots, narrow windows placed too high to reach, scratch marks on walls. These were holding cells, temporary prisons where people could be detained at the Lord's discretion outside any formal legal system. Calling them storage rooms makes modern visitors more comfortable and avoids uncomfortable questions about arbitrary imprisonment. Chapels and oratories underwent functional evolution that later historians preferred to ignore. Many began as genuine spaces for private prayer, but evolved into meeting rooms for secret councils, political negotiations, and sensitive discussions. The religious designation provided perfect cover. Who would question nobles gathering in a chapel? Account books sometimes reference council meetings in the chapel or payments to messengers waiting in the oratory, revealing usages that contradict the space's spiritual labels. Later families, wanting to emphasize their ancestors' piety, erased these political functions from official histories and restored the purely religious interpretation. Libraries and studies suffered similar revisionism. Rooms proudly displayed as centers of learning and scholarship were often counting houses, spaces where financial records were kept, where rents were collected, where account books tracked every penny flowing through the estate. Heavy doors with complex locks protected not rare manuscripts, but gold and silver. Built-in cabinets held ledgers rather than literature. Calling these spaces libraries elevated the family's intellectual reputation while obscuring their primary concern: money. This renaming occurred for multiple reasons. Victorian restorers made castles palatable to tourist sensibilities by sanitizing unpleasant realities. Families seeking to improve their ancestors' reputations rewrote room functions to emphasize culture and refinement over commerce and coercion. Some changes reflected genuine confusion. Later generations inheriting castles truly didn't know what certain rooms had been used for, and invented explanations that seemed plausible. Historians detect these renamed rooms through careful detective work. They compare documents from different periods and notice when room descriptions suddenly change with no architectural modification to explain the shift. They examine physical features, drainage systems, lock mechanisms, floor attachments that don't match claimed purposes. They cross-reference with account books describing activities inconsistent with official room designations: 3 prisoners held in the storage chamber, or treasury meeting in the library. What this means is profound. Even rooms that still exist, that tourists can walk through and photograph, may be fundamentally misunderstood. The labels on the doors might be lies. The tour guide's explanation might be fantasy. And the room's actual history might have been deliberately buried under layers of renaming and reinterpretation. But at least these rooms still exist, even if their identities have been obscured. There are other spaces that should exist based on what we know about castle populations and lifestyles. Yet they leave almost no physical or documentary trace. Entire categories of rooms that logic demands must have existed, but which have vanished so completely that we can barely prove they were ever there. Walk through any surviving castle today, and you'll notice something immediately. The grand hall dominates the space. Private chambers occupy the towers. Kitchens sprawl beneath vaulted ceilings, and bare stone rooms mark where servants once slept. Everything seems accounted for. The lord had his solar, the kitchen had its hearth. The guards had their barracks. But then you start asking different questions, and the architecture stops making sense. Where did the castle tutor teach the lord's children? Where did the doctor examine patients and store medicines? Where did the chaplain sleep when he wasn't in the chapel? Where did scribes spend hours copying letters and maintaining records? Where did visiting merchants negotiate with the household steward? Where did lawyers conduct estate business? Where did accountants maintain the complex financial records that we know existed? These activities weren't occasional. They were daily necessities of castle life, yet the rooms for them simply aren't there. The account books make this absence even stranger. Medieval financial records mention payments for the schoolroom, or repairs to the physician's chamber, or new shutters for the scrivener's office. These spaces clearly existed. People worked in them. Money was spent maintaining them, but architectural surveys of the same castles reveal no corresponding rooms. It's as if an entire middle layer of castle life occurred in spaces that have since been erased from physical reality. Several theories attempt to explain this void. Perhaps many of these spaces were temporary wooden structures built against stone walls, additions that rotted away centuries ago, leaving no trace except post holes that archaeologists might miss or misinterpret. Wood was cheaper than stone, and internal divisions could be constructed and modified as needs changed. A wooden partition could transform a corner of the Great Hall into a temporary office, then vanish when the household needed more space for a feast. Another possibility involves radical multipurposing. Perhaps rooms changed function throughout the day, like theatrical sets. The same chamber might serve as a classroom in the morning, a physician's consultation room in the afternoon, and overflow guest quarters in the evening. Medieval people may have been far more flexible about space than we imagine, carrying their work materials from place to place rather than maintaining dedicated offices. Some evidence suggests that many activities simply occurred in transitional spaces. Paintings from the period occasionally show scribes working at desks positioned in corridors or on stairway landings. Illuminated manuscripts depict tutors instructing children in window alcoves. Perhaps the medieval mind didn't categorize space the way we do. Perhaps corners of larger rooms, sections of passageways, and alcoves beneath staircases served as perfectly acceptable workplaces. The idea of everyone having their own dedicated room might be a modern expectation we're projecting backward. Outdoor courtyards present another answer. Many castle activities may have occurred in the open air whenever weather permitted. These courtyards are now empty expanses of paving stones, but they once bustled with temporary wooden benches, portable writing desks, and awnings that created semi-private spaces. An inner courtyard could function as an open-air office complex, with different corners claimed by different professionals who conducted their business under the sky. Archaeological evidence occasionally supports these theories. Excavations sometimes reveal patterns of post holes indicating temporary partitions. Analysis of wear patterns on stone floors suggests furniture arrangements that would have subdivided larger spaces. A few rare examples survive intact. A small office-like chamber tucked above a gatehouse passage, or a tiny counting room hidden behind a stairwell. Spaces so tucked away that they escaped later renovations. This missing middle reveals a broader pattern in how history gets recorded. We document spectacle, great halls, elaborate feasts, dramatic battles. We document survival, the minimum shelter needed for servants and guards. But the everyday middle ground, the routine professional activities that form the texture of daily life, often went unrecorded and unpreserved. It wasn't dramatic enough to chronicle, yet it was too ordinary to seem worth protecting. Reconstructing castle life means imagining these vanished spaces, accepting that much of what happened left minimal trace. The teachers, doctors, scribes, and lawyers existed. The work happened. But it occurred in ways that the stones no longer remember. Though physical rooms have disappeared, another form of evidence survived: written documents that recorded castle life. Yet these two documents present their own mystery. What remains is not a complete archive, but a carefully curated selection. And what's missing might tell us more than what's there. Open any surviving medieval castle document, and you'll find meticulous detail. Property boundaries, described down to the foot. Legal disputes recorded across dozens of parchment pages. Hunting rights enumerated with precision. Military expenses itemized, so many arrows, so much armor, precise costs for mercenary wages. Political agreements between noble families, carefully witnessed and sealed. Genealogies tracing bloodlines back generations. Religious endowments specifying exactly which prayers should be said for whose soul. Major architectural projects documented with contracts, payments, and completion dates. Formal correspondence between lords discussing matters of state, marriage negotiations, territorial claims. The documentary record seems rich, detailed, comprehensive, until you notice what isn't there. Birth and death records for servants don't exist. Details of daily routines went unrecorded. Personal relationships left no trace. Emotional lives, fears, hopes, frustrations, absent. How noble children were actually raised, who cared for them, what they were taught beyond formal subjects, missing. Women's activities appear only when involving property, transfers, or the occasional scandal. Servants' perspectives on their own lives, nowhere. The casual conversations that filled castle days, silent. The small decisions that shaped daily existence, unrecorded. This isn't accidental omission. It's systematic exclusion built into the very nature of medieval writing. Consider what it meant to create a written document in the 13th century. Parchment was expensive, prepared from animal skins through labor-intensive processes. A single page cost what a laborer earned in days. Skilled scribes were rare, their training taking years. Literacy itself was confined to a tiny fraction of the population, mostly clergy, some nobles, and specialized professionals. Ink, quills, preparation time, storage space, everything about writing represented significant investment. Therefore, only information deemed worth this expense got committed to parchment. Matters of law, because disputes over property could cost fortunes. Matters of money, because accounting prevented theft and managed estates. Matters of power, because political agreements needed verification. Religious matters, because souls hung in the balance. Architectural contracts, because building projects involved massive expenditure. Everything recorded served a purpose related to wealth, power, or salvation. Personal letters exist, but primarily for nobility. And even those focus overwhelmingly on business, politics, formal courtesies. A lady might write to her husband about estate management, marriage prospects for their children, or political news. She rarely mentioned how she spent her Tuesday afternoon, or what she thought about the servant who brought her breakfast. Not because these things didn't happen or didn't matter to her, but because parchment was for important matters. Look at a household account book from any major castle. you'll find extraordinary detail. 14 pounds of almonds purchased, 6 barrels of wine, payment for candle wax, horse feed quantities, weapon repairs. But you won't find who cooked these ingredients, what meals they became, or whether anyone enjoyed eating them. Building contracts describe construction specifications with precision: wall thickness, stone quality, timber dimensions, but never name the labourers who quarried stone, hauled materials, or risked their lives on scaffolding. Hunting logs record every deer killed, noting date, location, and weather conditions. Yet the beaters who drove game, the handlers who managed dogs, the servants who processed carcasses, they're invisible. The pattern reveals itself everywhere. A steward's account from 1423 contains 847 entries. It meticulously tracks spending on spices, candles, repairs, supplies. It doesn't mention a single human birth or death, except when a noble died, an inheritance required documentation. No servant names appear except in rare cases of theft or scandal. According to this document, the castle was inhabited entirely by aristocrats floating through spaces where expenses occurred, but people didn't exist. This creates fundamental distortion in historical understanding. We know castle life exclusively through documents created by and for a tiny elite, recording only what that elite considered worth preserving. Everything else, the actual lived experience of most castle inhabitants, went unrecorded, not because it wasn't real, but because it wasn't considered important enough for expensive parchment. Our documentary sources aren't neutral windows into the past. They're curated records, reflecting the values and priorities of those with power to create and preserve writing. The silence in the archives isn't absence of activity. It's absence of interest in documenting the lives of people who lack the wealth, status, or power to seem worth remembering. Yet, while official documents systematically excluded most castle inhabitants, another form of writing survived. Hidden in margins, carved into stones, scratched where no one was supposed to look. Unofficial texts left by people who weren't supposed to leave their mark at all. The official documents said nothing about them, but the stones remember. Run your fingers along the walls of any medieval castle tower and you'll find them. Scratches, carvings, names carved when no one was supposed to write. Not elegant inscriptions commissioned by lords. Rough marks made by people who weren't supposed to leave any trace at all. Medieval graffiti covers castle walls. Hundreds of marks that official history ignored, but that the carvers themselves refused to let disappear. These aren't polished texts. Their names scratched with knife points, dates marked into mortar, prayers etched by trembling hands. Protective symbols gouged deep into stone. Love declarations. Insults. Crude drawings of things that can't be misunderstood. Mysterious symbols whose meanings died with the carvers. So each mark represents someone who knew they wouldn't appear in any chronicle or account book, so they wrote themselves into the architecture instead. The authors weren't the literate elite. They were people on the margins who possessed just enough literacy to leave their names. Servants who could write a few words but not sentences, soldiers marking time in endless garrison duty, craftspeople signing work that would be hidden behind plaster, prisoners counting days in cells, travelers proving they existed by carving into window frames. Their handwriting is rough, spelling phonetic and inconsistent, but the intent is unmistakable. I was here. I existed. Remember me. In a kitchen fireplace, buried in mortar, a brick bear scratched letters. Maria made this. The brick would be covered, invisible, but Maria carved her name anyway. No official document mentions any cook named Maria. Yet, she existed, made bricks, and refused to vanish silently into history. Somewhere in a garrison tower, windowsills carry elaborate dice game boards etched into stone. Soldiers gambling away boredom in patterns worn smooth by years of use. Religious symbols and protective marks cluster around doorways and sleeping areas, scratched by people seeking spiritual protection the official clergy couldn't or wouldn't provide. Some marks are moving in their simplicity. In a storage room, crude letters spell out an epitaph. John died here, winter 1392. God keep him in town. John received no official memorial since someone who loved him carved this remembrance into stone, making sure he wouldn't be completely forgotten. In a corridor, letters hidden under later whitewash remained invisible for centuries until conservators discovered them in 2019. Thomas the Cook was here 1486. The Lord is a bastard. Thomas risked severe punishment, possibly death, to make sure that specific message survived. Someone needed future generations to know that he served and that the Lord was terrible. Modern researchers now systematically document this parallel archive. High-resolution photography reveals marks invisible to casual inspection. Three-dimensional scanning captures carvings worn nearly smooth by time. Every survey reveals more. Walls that seemed blank contain layers of hidden writing. Voices speaking across centuries because the carvers made their marks deep enough to outlast attempts at erasure. What these marks reveal challenges assumptions. Literacy extended further down the social hierarchy than official records suggest. Servants, soldiers, and laborers possessed writing skills even if they never authored formal documents. The graffiti exposes personal concerns official sources ignored. Religious anxieties, romantic relationships, humor, frustration with authority, pride in work, grief for friends. Popular culture emerges. Jokes, games, drawings, showing what ordinary people found entertaining or important. Most fundamentally, the graffiti demonstrates resistance to erasure. Official documents excluded these people, declared them unworthy of record. The people themselves disagreed. They grabbed whatever tools they had, knives, nails, stones, and carved their existence into walls. They knew stone outlasts parchment. They knew their marks, if made deep enough, would survive longer than account books. While they couldn't control official archives, they could create their own. And they did. Literally writing themselves into history one scratch at a time. Both official documents and unauthorized carvings exist in visible spaces, halls, chambers, towers above ground. But castles had another entire level. Below the courtyards and beneath the foundations, underground spaces preserved different evidence that no one wrote about because it was never meant to be seen at all. The most carefully preserved documents tell us what powerful people wanted remembered. The most revealing documents survived because nobody thought they mattered at all. Medieval archives contain letters and papers that exist today purely by accident. They weren't deemed important enough for official preservation. Instead, they survived through random chance, recycled as stuffing in later book bindings when someone needed padding material, plastered into walls during renovations when workers grabbed whatever paper was handy, wrapped around food purchases and then discarded in middens where archaeology eventually found them, sealed in rooms that were forgotten or locked in trunks that no one opened for centuries. These accidental archives matter precisely because they weren't curated. Official archives preserve documents someone decided were important: property records, significant correspondence, matters of state. Accidental survival is random. It captures the mundane, the embarrassing, and the routine communication that careful archivists excluded. What survives by accident reveals what people actually thought and did, not what they wanted posterity to believe. In 2003, a student working in a library began carefully peeling apart a decaying book cover from the 16th century. Bookbinders often used scrap parchment and paper as structural material, recycling documents considered worthless. This cover contained several letters. One read, "Send help. Lady Margaret is mad with grief. The child died last night. Tell no one. The match must proceed." The official family history records a wedding that year between Lady Margaret and a neighbouring lord. It mentions no dead child, no grief, no desperation. The marriage was politically important. Evidence of tragedy needed to disappear. Personal letters between castle servants turn up in wall cavities, stuffed there during construction or renovation. These letters reveal concerns official documents ignored: worries about sick relatives, loans between friends, romantic relationships, complaints about working conditions. They demonstrate literacy among people assumed illiterate. They show emotional lives and personal networks that formal records erased. Love letters between nobles and inappropriate partners, servants, clergy who'd taken vows, married neighbours, were hidden rather than destroyed. The authors couldn't bear to eliminate physical proof of relationships that brought them happiness, but displaying such letters would cause scandal. So they hid them, and sometimes hiding preserved them for centuries, while official correspondence decayed. Business papers detailing transactions, considered too petty for formal accounting books, survived as scrap material. These reveal daily economic life: small loans, minor trades, household expenses. Someone didn't think worth recording in official ledgers. A note about purchasing eggs and cheese from a specific farmer. A receipt for having laundry done. A complaint about spoiled meat. Individually trivial. Collectively, they reconstruct the economic networks and daily routines that kept castles functioning. Household notes accidentally preserved show unguarded moments. A frustrated message about a child's misbehavior. Instructions for dealing with a servant's drinking problem. A reminder to purchase rat poison for the granary. Notes about personal health issues. These mundane concerns never entered official records because they weren't considered important. But they reveal honest anxieties and routine challenges that occupied people's actual attention. What makes these documents special is their lack of performance. Official correspondence was written for posterity, crafted to present specific images. Accidental survivals were written for immediate purposes, with no thought that anyone centuries later would read them. They contain unguarded truth, honest concerns, casual admissions, emotions people wouldn't display in formal documents. The irony is perfect. The most candid glimpses into castle life survived precisely because they were considered worthless, too unimportant for official preservation, but also too trivial to bother deliberately destroying. They slipped through the curation process that created official archives, surviving in gaps where no one paid attention. Sometimes the most revealing evidence is what nobody meant to keep. The random survivals that escaped the filtering process powerful people used to control their historical image. Written evidence, whether official or accidental, only reveals what people chose to write or accidentally preserved. To truly understand castle life, we must go deeper, literally beneath the surface, into foundations and crypts and dungeons where archaeology uncovers truths that no one wrote down and physical evidence of forgotten lives remains buried in the earth. Stand in any castle's great hall, and you're looking at one moment in time. The final version, the surface that survived. But beneath your feet lie centuries of earlier flaws, discarded lives, and buried secrets. Archaeology reveals that castles aren't single structures, but accumulated layers of history, each generation building over the previous one, creating deposits like pages in a book. To understand castle life, you must dig down through these pages, recovering the physical evidence of everyday existence that no document recorded. When archaeologists excavate beneath castle floors, they discover stratigraphy, distinct layers representing different periods. A floor from the 18th century. Below that, 17th century debris. Deeper still, medieval construction layers. Each level contains material remains. Broken pottery and glassware revealing changing fashions and trade connections over centuries. Animal bones showing what people ate and how waste disposal patterns evolved. Seeds and plant remains indicating garden layouts and food preparation methods. Lost personal items like jewelry, coins, pins, and keys that slipped between floorboards. Discarded tools showing what work occurred in which spaces. And industrial waste from metalworking, leatherworking, and textile production. This mundane debris often contradicts official histories. Luxury goods appear in servant quarters. Expensive pottery fragments, glass beads, fine fabric scraps, suggesting theft, trade relationships, or gifts between social classes that no document mentions. Certain foods show up in contexts that violate supposedly strict religious dietary laws. Evidence of ironworking appears in locations officially designated for entirely different purposes. Concentrations of children's toys emerge in areas where children supposedly never went. The physical evidence reveals that actual behavior diverged significantly from official rules. Specific excavations expose these contradictions. Beneath a French castle's chapel, archaeologists found layers predating the Christian structure. Evidence of pagan worship, including carved stones, ritual deposits, and burning patterns, suggesting ceremonies the medieval church would have condemned. The chapel was built directly over this earlier sacred space, perhaps to Christianize it, perhaps to suppress memory of what happened there before. Official documents describe the chapel's consecration in 1294. They don't mention the pagan past, sealed beneath its stones. Excavation beneath an English castle kitchen revealed 7 distinct construction phases spanning 4 centuries. Each layer showed evolving cooking technology. Early simple hearths, giving way to more complex arrangements with bread ovens, then massive fireplaces, then eventually more efficient designs. The layers also contained bones showing how diet changed. Early periods featured more local game and fish. Later periods showed increased reliance on domesticated animals and imported spices. Historical documents mention the kitchen's existence, but never its evolution. The archaeology reconstructed centuries of culinary change from discarded bones and ash deposits. In Scotland, foundation trenches revealed that a castle celebrated for its grand medieval scale actually began as a much smaller fortification. The earliest phase consisted of a modest tower that historical documents never described. Later construction expanded dramatically, but rather than demolishing the original tower, builders incorporated it into the larger structure. Official chronicles claim the castle was built at its full impressive size by a powerful lord. Physical evidence proved it started humbly and grew over generations. A less heroic but more honest story. Modern technology now reveals underground secrets without excavation. Ground-penetrating radar sends electromagnetic waves through soil and stone, detecting density variations that indicate buried structures, voids, and anomalies. Surveys of castle sites reveal hidden chambers, sealed during renovations, passages filled in and forgotten, foundation walls from buildings that were dismantled, and mysterious voids whose purpose remains unclear. These technologies show that beneath every visible castle lies an invisible twin, buried phases, hidden spaces, and abandoned passages that official histories don't mention. When archaeologists excavated beneath one castle's great hall, they found something that stopped them cold. A perfectly preserved earlier floor, undamaged, simply buried beneath a layer of clean sand and then built over. Demolishing the old floor would have been easier and cheaper. Instead, someone went to enormous effort to seal it carefully and hide it intact. What were they covering up? The floor itself revealed nothing obvious. No stains, no damage, no evidence of violence. Yet someone needed it gone from sight, but preserved beneath the surface, as if erasing visible evidence while maintaining some secret reason to keep it existing below. The castle above ground is literal, supported by hidden layers of history. Understanding castle life requires excavating through these deposits, recovering the material truth that people discarded, lost, or deliberately buried. Archaeological layers reveal horizontal history, time periods stacked vertically. But castles also contain purpose-built underground spaces, chambers intentionally constructed below the surface for specific functions that required darkness, secrecy, and separation from the world above. Castles weren't just surface structures. Their designers deliberately built downward, creating entire underground realms hidden from daylight. These weren't accidental spaces or later additions. They were intentional architecture. Dungeons, crypts, cisterns, vaults, and passages designed from the beginning to function below ground. Their existence reveals what castle life required when darkness, secrecy, and separation from the world above became necessary. Start with dungeons, since they dominate popular imagination. The word itself comes from French donjon, meaning the keep, the strongest tower. But its meaning shifted to describe prison spaces, usually underground or in tower basements. Medieval dungeons weren't the permanent prisons we imagine. Most held people temporarily as an awaiting trial, awaiting ransom payment, or awaiting execution. Long-term imprisonment was expensive and unusual. Dungeons were holding areas, though what awaited prisoners made that distinction cold comfort. Archaeological analysis reveals what these spaces were actually like. Wall scratches show prisoner activity. Marks counting days, prayers scratched in desperation, names carved to prove existence. Absence or presence of light sources indicates intent. Window slits suggest prisoners weren't meant to be completely isolated. Sealed stone chambers prove someone wanted absolute darkness. Evidence of heating or ventilation or lack thereof shows whether preserving prisoner health mattered. Human remains tell final stories about conditions and outcomes. Dungeon architecture varied dramatically based on purpose. Some were designed for relatively humane custody, windows admitting light and air, evidence of furniture attachments for berths or tables, proper latrines, heating sources. These held valuable prisoners whose ransom potential required keeping them alive and reasonably healthy. Other dungeons were designed to break prisoners psychologically. Perpetual darkness, dampness that soaked into bones, isolation so complete that guards pass food through slots without speaking. And then there were oubliettes, from French oublier to forget. Vertical pits accessed only from above, often too narrow to lie down in. Prisoners lowered into oubliettes might be forgotten entirely, left until they died, and their bodies decayed in darkness no one would ever illuminate. Moving beyond dungeons, crypts formed another underground layer. These weren't merely burial spaces. They stored family treasures, housed document archives, and sometimes served as refuge during sieges. The relationship between the living castle above and the dead kingdom below was complex. Some crypts were active spaces. Family members visited regularly for prayer and commemoration. Others were sealed deliberately, separated from daily life. The dead locked away where they wouldn't intrude on the living. Crypt architecture reveals these attitudes. Elaborate stairs and decorated spaces versus simple sealed chambers. Secret passages and escape tunnels occupy a murky space between reality and legend. Some definitely existed. Archaeological surveys trace passages from inner chambers to exit points hundreds of feet away. Others are probable myths or later additions to castle lore. What's real? Many castles included hidden routes for emergency escape or covert movement. What's exaggerated? The idea that vast networks of passages honeycombed beneath every castle. Building and maintaining such tunnels required enormous expense and engineering skill. Underground cisterns formed critical infrastructure. Massive chambers carved from bedrock or built with waterproof mortar stored water for siege survival. Some could hold enough for months. These weren't decorative features. They were life or death engineering, usually hidden from view, but essential for the castle's defensive purpose. Cistern construction reveals sophisticated understanding of hydraulics, filtration, and water preservation. Modern surveys reveal spaces that surviving records never mention. Tourists walk over one castle floor dozens of times daily. Beneath it, ground-penetrating radar shows a chamber 30 feet deep. No historical document describes this room. Survey teams named it the acoustic chamber because of peculiar echo properties that would amplify sound perfectly. Specifically, properties that would amplify screams. Whether this was intentional or coincidental remains unknown. The room exists. Its acoustic properties are measurable. Its purpose stays hidden. These underground spaces weren't afterthoughts. They were integral to castle function, designed with the same care as great halls and towers. Their architecture reveals priorities. Security requiring hidden storage, survival demanding water reserves, control needing spaces to hold prisoners, and sometimes cruelty finding expression in chambers designed to destroy hope. Yet these purpose-built medieval spaces sometimes revealed even deeper layers. Excavations in castle foundations occasionally exposed evidence that predated the castles themselves, structures from centuries or millennia earlier, suggesting these sites were special long before anyone built medieval fortifications over them. The ground beneath a castle holds secrets that medieval chroniclers never recorded. When archaeologists sink their first trenches through castle courtyards or excavate beneath foundation stones, they're not digging into virgin earth. They're cutting through centuries, sometimes millennia, of earlier human activity. The castles we think of as beginning points in a landscape's history are often just the most recent chapter in stories that stretch back into the deep past. Castle builders didn't choose their locations randomly. They selected sites that had already proven their worth over vast stretches of time. A hilltop that offers commanding views and natural defense in the 12th century offered those same advantages in the Iron Age, 2,000 years earlier. A river crossing that made strategic sense to a Norman lord made identical sense to a Roman general. And before him, to tribal chieftains whose names no record preserves. The landscape itself dictated importance, and humans across millennia responded to the same geographic logic. When excavations go deep enough, the layers reveal themselves. Beneath the medieval foundation stones, archaeologists find the defensive ditches and ramparts of Iron Age hill forts, their earthwork still visible in the modern landscape if you know where to look. These weren't abandoned ruins when castle builders arrived. They were functioning landscapes, their ancient defenses sometimes incorporated directly into medieval fortifications. Thousands of years of defensive thinking literally stacked one atop another. Some excavations cut through medieval floors to reveal Roman mosaic patterns underneath, bright tesserae forming geometric designs that medieval feet walked over daily. In certain castles, the foundation walls contain Roman stones, carefully extracted from earlier buildings and reused, their Latin inscriptions sometimes still legible, facing inward where no one would see them. The medieval builders knew these stones came from an older civilization. They chose to build their new power structures on top of Rome's physical remains, perhaps seeing continuity, perhaps claiming inheritance. The pattern repeats across Europe. Castle chapels that appear thoroughly Christian in their architecture sit atop sites that show clear evidence of pre-Christian worship. Excavations beneath chapel floors uncover votive offerings, ritual deposits, and structural remains that speak to religious practices from before Christianity arrived. The later builders knew these were sacred sites. That's precisely why they chose them. Holiness, once established in a landscape, apparently persisted across changes in faith and culture. Even the practical infrastructure shows continuity. Castle wells, when properly excavated and studied, often reveal use that extends back centuries before the castle existed. The same water source that supplied a medieval garrison supplied a Roman villa before it, and a prehistoric settlement before that. Archaeologists can trace continuous use of certain wells for 3, 4, 5,000 years. The water that rises in that particular spot has been drawing humans to it since the Bronze Age, and every successive culture that occupied the site rediscovered the same essential resource. This creates a profound shift in how we understand these places. What we call a medieval castle is actually the most recent occupant of a location that humans have found valuable, defensible, or sacred for timeframes that dwarf the medieval period. The castle is one phase in a multi-period archaeological site. Understanding its full history means excavating backward through Norman, Saxon, Roman, Iron Age, Bronze Age, and sometimes even Neolithic layers. Each excavation potentially reveals another chapter in the site's biography. The implications ripple outward. These locations weren't blank pages when the first stones of a castle were laid. They were already thick with human meaning, layered with memory, marked by countless earlier lives. The castle builders were inheriting landscapes that had already witnessed thousands of years of human struggle, worship, daily routine, and death. They were adding to palimpsests, not creating new texts. Strategic locations remain strategic. Defensive positions remain defensible. Sacred sites retain their holiness, even as the gods change names. The landscape itself has memory, encoded not in documents, but in the physical accumulation of human choices made across incomprehensible spans of time. Later occupants built upon earlier work, both literally, using the same stones and earthworks, and figuratively, responding to the same geographic logic that had drawn humans to these places since deep prehistory. When we explore a castle's forgotten history, we discover we're actually uncovering one chapter in a narrative that began long before medieval chroniclers picked up their pens and will continue long after the castle itself crumbles. The story of any castle site is ultimately the story of that specific piece of earth and its long, layered relationship with human civilization. A 14th century household account from a major English castle lists the entire residential population in careful categories. Knights and men-at-arms are named individually. Craftsmen are enumerated by specialty. Servants are counted and sometimes identified. Then, near the bottom of the page, one line reads, "And the women." No number, no names, no categories. Just an acknowledgement that women existed somewhere in the castle, their presence noted, but their identities apparently not worth the ink. This isn't an isolated example. It's a pattern that repeats across centuries of castle documentation. In a fortress that housed 400 people, historical records might preserve the names of 8 to 12 women, all of them noble or closely connected to noble families. But basic mathematics and archaeological evidence tell a different story. Women comprised somewhere between 40 and 50% of castle populations. In that 400-person fortress, somewhere between 180 and 190 women lived, worked, ate, slept, laughed, grieved, and died. Almost all of them left no trace in the historical record. They've been erased so thoroughly that reconstructing their lives requires detective work that borders on archaeology of absence, trying to understand what isn't there. The women who do appear in documents follow predictable patterns. Noble women surface in property records when they inherit estates or when those estates transfer through marriage. They appear in genealogies as crucial links between male family members, their own identities reduced to their function as mothers, daughters, and wives. Occasionally, they emerge in chronicle accounts when their behavior created scandal or political complications. Some appear in religious documents when they founded chapels or made significant donations. But their everyday existence, their work, their relationships with other women, their thoughts and feelings, their complex interior lives, all of this goes largely unrecorded. The erasure becomes more complete as you move down the social hierarchy. Noble women at least appear in the documents, even if their portrayal is filtered through male perspectives and limited to moments when they intersected with property or lineage. Below them, whole categories of women vanish almost entirely. Gentlewomen and ladies in waiting performed complex roles that combined companionship, household management, diplomatic communication, and cultural production. But records reduced them to single words like attendants or companions, as if their presence was decorative rather than functional. Female servants present an even stranger documentary ghost. Account books record payments to laundresses 3 shillings, or to women workers in the dairy 5 pence. Their labour is acknowledged, its cost carefully tracked. But the women themselves remain unnamed, merged into categorical expenses like candles or horseshoes. The household paid them, depended on their work, couldn't function without them, but didn't consider them worth identifying as individual human beings. Some women were economically essential, yet completely invisible. Dairying in medieval castles was almost exclusively women's work, a skilled trade requiring knowledge of animal husbandry, fermentation, and preservation. Brewing, producing the ale that was the primary beverage for most castle residents, was similarly dominated by female labour. Textile production, from spinning thread to weaving cloth, employed women throughout the castle economy. These weren't marginal activities. They were fundamental to castle operation. Yet the women who perform this work appear in records, if at all as collective categories or as line items in accounts. Then there are the women who existed outside the boundaries of official recognition entirely. Women in informal relationships with castle men, long-term partners who shared lives but not legal status, mothers of children recognized by their fathers but not legitimized by marriage. Lovers whose relationships lasted years or decades but couldn't be acknowledged in polite society. These women moved through castle spaces, interacted with other residents, contributed to household life, but left almost no documentary trace. They were too socially irregular to record, their existence acknowledged in whispers but not in writing. The reasons for this systematic erasure aren't mysterious. Medieval record-keeping focused primarily on property and legal status, 2 areas where women had severely limited rights. A woman couldn't usually own property independently, couldn't enter contracts without male oversight, couldn't testify in most legal proceedings. The very systems that generated historical records were built around transactions and relationships in which women couldn't fully participate. They were structurally excluded from the activities that created documentation. The people who kept records contributed to the pattern. Chroniclers were overwhelmingly male clergy, educated in institutions that considered women spiritually and intellectually inferior. Their interests focused on warfare, politics, religious affairs, and the deeds of great men. Women's lives, even noble women's lives, fell outside their circle of concern unless those lives intersected dramatically with male affairs. The everyday existence of castle women, their work and relationships and thoughts, simply didn't register as historically significant. Social norms reinforced these documentary silences. Medieval culture considered women's activities less important than men's activities, almost by definition. Even essential work became invisible when women performed it. Brewing might be economically crucial, but because women did it, it wasn't worth documenting in detail. The care of children, the management of household textiles, the preparation of food, all fundamental to castle function, were relegated to an unspoken background, assumed rather than recorded. This creates a profound challenge for anyone trying to understand castle life. We're attempting to reconstruct the experiences of half the population using sources that systematically ignored them. It's like trying to understand a conversation when only one person's voice was recorded. You can infer some of what the other person said from the responses you hear, but vast portions of the exchange remain lost. You know the other person was there, was participating, was contributing, but their actual words have vanished. The women existed. They lived full lives, complex lives filled with work and relationships and joy and suffering and everything else that makes up human experience. They weren't footnotes to male castle life. They were half of castle life, fundamental and irreplaceable. But the systems that created historical memory considered them unworthy of remembering. So they've been erased, reduced to occasional names and categorical references, their rich existence compressed into documentary silence. We know they were there. We just have to work much harder to hear them. The castle couldn't have functioned for a single week without women's work. Yet that work appears in historical records primarily as absence, as things that simply existed without apparent effort or origin. Clothing appeared on bodies. Bread appeared on tables. Ale-filled cups. Sick people recovered or didn't. Children grew. The castle remained clean enough to be habitable. None of this happened spontaneously. Yet the labor that made it happen was so thoroughly naturalized as female obligation that it became invisible even to the people who depended on it daily. Textile production alone represented a staggering volume of labor. Every piece of cloth in the castle, every sheet, shirt, banner, curtain, tablecloth, towel, and garment was produced by hand. Thread had to be spun from raw wool or flax, a process requiring skill, constant attention, and endless hours. Archaeological analysis of spindle whorls found in castle excavations reveals something almost shocking. The wear patterns and the quantities of thread documented in account books suggest women spent approximately 8 hours daily spinning. Not occasionally, daily for their entire adult lives. This wasn't specialized work performed by a few dedicated craftswomen. This was background labor expected of virtually every woman in the castle, from noble ladies to the lowest servants. After spinning came weaving, transforming thread into cloth on looms that required both technical knowledge and physical strength. Then came finishing, fulling, dyeing, cutting, and garment construction. Each stage required different skills. The account books occasionally note purchases of raw wool or dye stuffs, inadvertently documenting the scale of production. But the women who transform these raw materials into finished textiles appear, if at all, as collective categories. The records acknowledge the economic importance while erasing the humans who performed the work. Food production represented another vast domain of female labor. Dairying was skilled work requiring knowledge that passed between women across generations. How to manage milk production from castle herds. When to skim cream and when to leave it. How to coax milk into butter or cheese. Understanding the precise temperatures and times that meant the difference between preserved food and spoiled waste. Brewing required similar expertise. Ale was the primary beverage for most castle residents, consumed daily by everyone from the lord to the stable boys. Women brewed it in enormous quantities, understanding fermentation, ingredient ratios, timing, and storage techniques that kept the castle supplied year-round. Preserving food extended the harvest and across seasons. Women transformed summer abundance into winter survival through pickling, smoking, drying, and salting techniques that required precise knowledge and careful judgment. They maintained herb gardens, understanding which plants aided digestion, which reduced fever, which flavored food or repelled insects. This botanical knowledge blurred the boundary between cookery and medicine, between nutrition and healing. Care work existed in a category that historical records barely acknowledge. Childcare consumed enormous time and energy, yet chronicles mention children primarily when they died or when their marriages created political alliances. The years of nursing, teaching, protecting, and raising them vanish from documentation. Similarly, nursing sick and elderly castle residents fell primarily to women, who understood herbal remedies, poultices, and treatments that account books sometimes note through purchases of medicinal ingredients. Women also prepared bodies for burial, washing and shrouding the dead, performing intimate labor that marked the boundary between life and whatever came after. Noble women performed extensive household management work that account books credited to male stewards. They organized servant labor, managed supply inventories, oversaw cleaning and maintenance, coordinated the complex logistics that kept large households functioning. The few surviving household management books, written by and for women, reveal sophisticated knowledge of economics, seasonal planning, medicinal recipes, and diplomatic handling of servant relationships. These weren't simple recipe collections. They were comprehensive management manuals requiring literacy, numeracy, and administrative skills that historical narratives rarely acknowledge noble women possessed. Religious and educational work created another layer of female responsibility. Women taught children basic literacy and religious knowledge. They led household prayers and organized religious observances. They created religious textiles, altar cloths, vestments, devotional embroideries that combined artistic skill with spiritual expression. Some produced or illuminated manuscripts, work requiring years of training and exceptional skill. Though male scribes usually received credit even for books that female hands actually created. The archaeological evidence makes women's work visible in ways documents don't. Excavations reveal dense concentrations of spindle whorls, loom weights, needles, and thimbles in certain castle areas, mapping spaces where textile production occurred. Storage rooms contain vessels designed for dairying and brewing. Kitchen areas show wear patterns consistent with constant food preparation. The physical residue of women's labor persists in the ground even when their names and faces have vanished from memory. Account books inadvertently document the scale of this work through purchases of raw materials. Entries recording acquisition of wool, flax, brewing grains, dyestuffs, and medicinal herbs reveal production volumes that required constant labor from multiple women. The books track inputs and sometimes outputs, creating a negative space where women's transformation of materials into finished goods should appear, but doesn't. Visual sources provide occasional glimpses. Manuscript illuminations sometimes show women spinning, weaving, or engaged in household tasks, though these images were created by male artists working from assumptions rather than observation. The few images that do exist suggest the artists considered women's work worth depicting primarily as symbolic background, not as subjects deserving focused attention. This work was skilled labor. It required knowledge that took years to acquire, techniques passed between women through demonstration and practice, judgment developed through experience, and physical strength and endurance that matched any male labor in the castle. Yet, It was treated as natural female obligation, something women simply did because of their nature rather than learn expertise deserving compensation and recognition. The castle economy absolutely depended on this work. Without it, the entire structure would have collapsed within days. But because women performed it, it didn't count as real labor worthy of historical memory. Every castle had a hidden geography that most visitors never saw. A network of spaces where women lived, worked, and exercised forms of power that the Great Hall and battlements never acknowledged. These weren't marginal areas tucked into forgotten corners. They were deliberately designed spaces, carefully positioned within the castle's architecture, creating a parallel world that operated according to different rules and hierarchies than the male-dominated public areas. The Solar occupied some of the castle's most desirable real estate, typically located on an upper floor. This private chamber served as the lady's primary space, where she managed household business, entertained female guests, worked on textile projects, and slept. Architectural analysis reveals that Solas received design attention that contradicts the notion of women's spaces as afterthoughts. They had more windows than equivalent male spaces, providing better natural light. They showed evidence of superior heating systems, with fireplaces positioned for maximum comfort and sometimes with tile stoves or other heating innovations. Archaeological excavations find remnants of cushions, wall hangings, and decorative elements, suggesting these rooms were significantly more comfortable than the stark military spaces that dominate castle imagery. Many solas connected to private gardens or terraces, creating outdoor extensions of female space. These weren't purely ornamental. They were working gardens where women cultivated herbs for medicine, cooking, and household use, spaces that combined aesthetic pleasure with practical production. The positioning of solas, away from the noisy public Great Hall, often with separate access routes, created zones of relative privacy within structures that offered little privacy to most inhabitants. The bower represented another category of female space, dedicated specifically to textile production. In large castles, the bower might be a separate building or a substantial room housing multiple women working simultaneously. Evidence suggests these spaces had specialized features. Excellent natural light from multiple windows, positioning to catch daylight for as many hours as possible, storage for materials and tools, and often heating that made long hours of sedentary work bearable during cold months. Archaeological finds in probable bower locations include dense concentrations of textile working tools, spindle whorls, weaving weights, needles, and shears, mapping spaces where women transformed raw materials into finished cloth. These weren't silent, isolated spaces. Multiple women working together created social centers where conversation, storytelling, and relationship building occurred alongside labor. Women of different ranks worked in proximity, creating contact that would have been unusual in the hierarchically segregated main castle spaces. The bower was simultaneously a workplace, a social space, and a site where female hierarchies and power relationships operated independently from male oversight. The lying-in chamber created perhaps the most exclusively female environment within the castle. When a noblewoman approached childbirth, a room was prepared specifically for delivery and recovery, a process that took weeks. She would retreat into this space before labor began, attended by female servants, midwives, and female relatives. Men, including husbands, were excluded. For this period, the lying-in chamber became a temporary female domain where male authority couldn't penetrate, where women controlled events and made decisions according to female knowledge and traditions. Evidence suggests these chambers were carefully prepared, windows covered to control light, herbs scattered for scent and supposed protective properties, religious items positioned for spiritual protection. The woman might spend 4 to 6 weeks in this space, being attended, recovering, bonding with her infant, before re-emerging into normal castle life. During this time, female attendants managed everything, creating a bubble of female autonomy within the male-controlled castle structure. Some castles had female-only chapels or prayer spaces, smaller than the main chapel, where women conducted private devotions without male oversight. Herb gardens, as mentioned, operated as female-managed spaces where botanical knowledge passed between women. Dairy houses and brew houses, though technically part of the castle's productive economy, functioned as female work domains where men rarely entered and where senior women exercised authority over junior ones. Senior female servants had their own chambers that reflected their status. The head laundress, the head cook, the lady's chief attendant. These women occupied spaces that gave them privacy and authority within their domains. Their rooms might be modest compared to noble quarters, but they represented significant status distinction from the communal sleeping areas where lower servants lived. This geography created a parallel power structure. Within female spaces, women exercised authority, made decisions, organized work, and built relationships that operated independently from male-dominated hierarchies. A senior female servant might have little power in the Great Hall but complete authority in the laundry or dairy, commanding other women and managing essential castle functions. The architecture both created and reflected this separation. Some castles had secondary staircases, narrower, less prominent than main stairs, that connected female spaces vertically. A woman could move from solar to bower to garden to chapel without entering male-dominated public areas. Private doors connected female rooms, creating circulation paths invisible to anyone moving through the castle's main spaces. The placement of women's areas, often in wings or upper floors away from the Great Hall and outer bailey, created physical distance that translated into social separation. This wasn't necessarily pure oppression, though it certainly reflected and enforced gender inequality. These separate spaces also created zones of female autonomy, areas where women controlled their environment and operated according to female hierarchies and relationships. Within the larger structure of male power, these spaces allowed forms of female authority and culture that couldn't exist in mixed spaces. Most castle tours ignore this geography entirely. They follow routes through great halls, into chapels, onto battlements, the public, military, male-dominated spaces that match popular castle imagery. The narrow staircase connecting female spaces goes unmentioned. The solar becomes a bedroom, without exploration of its function as female headquarters. The bower, if it survives, gets misidentified as a storage room. The architectural evidence of a complete parallel female world within the castle remains hidden, visible only to researchers who specifically look for it. Yet it was there. Women moved through these connected spaces daily, creating lives and relationships and cultures that the male-dominated historical record never captured. Behind the visible castle existed this hidden geography, A women's world operating in spaces that architectural analysis is only now learning to recognize and reconstruct. There's a specific word for what happened to hundreds of castles across Europe. A word that sounds almost gentle, but describes deliberate, calculated violence. Slighting. The systematic military demolition of fortifications to ensure they could never threaten anyone again. These weren't buildings that crumbled slowly over centuries. They were structures that armies destroyed methodically, transforming defensive strongholds into permanent monuments to defeat. The practice peaked during civil wars, when castles changed hands repeatedly, and victorious factions needed insurance against future reversals. A castle you captured today might be retaken tomorrow and used against you. The solution wasn't occupation or even abandonment. It was destruction thorough enough to eliminate the military value entirely, remove the castle from the strategic equation permanently. After the English Civil War, Parliament ordered the slighting of dozens of royalist castles. The goal wasn't to erase the buildings completely, but to destroy their defensive capability. Commissioners arrived with soldiers, engineers, and sometimes barrels of gunpowder, tasked with rendering these fortifications militarily useless. The work was selective and strategic. Residential portions might be left standing, allowing owners to continue living in their ancestral homes. But towers came down. Walls were breached. Gatehouses were demolished. Everything that made the castle defensible was systematically destroyed. The techniques varied depending on resources and urgency. The simplest method was undermining, digging beneath wall foundations until the structure collapsed under its own weight. Engineers would excavate chambers beneath towers or walls, shore them up with wooden props, pack the space with combustible material, then set fires. When the supporting timbers burned through, tons of stone crashed downward. The process required skill and patience, but needed minimal equipment. Gunpowder, when available, produced more dramatic results. Charges placed against walls or beneath foundations could bring down in seconds what might take weeks to undermine. The effect wasn't just physical, but psychological. The explosion, the dust cloud, the sudden transformation of solid architecture into rubble, these were spectacles of power, demonstrations that no fortification was permanent, no defensive strength absolute. Some slighting involved painstaking deconstruction rather than explosive demolition. Workers removed stones individually, creating breaches precise enough to eliminate defensive advantages while preserving other sections. This allowed commissioners to leave residential quarters intact while destroying battlements, turning a military fortress into a vulnerable mansion. The message was clear: you may keep your home, but you'll never again have the power to resist. The patterns of destruction reveal strategic thinking. Walls weren't randomly damaged, but broken in specific locations to create what military engineers called kill zones, openings that made defense impossible. If attackers could enter through multiple breaches simultaneously, defenders couldn't concentrate their forces effectively. The castle became indefensible, not because it was completely destroyed, but because its defensive geometry had been surgically disrupted. Border castles faced slighting during peace treaties, when their military function became politically inconvenient. A fortification that was strategic during war became provocative during peace. Rather than maintain these expensive reminders of conflict, authorities often ordered their demolition, removing temptation and reducing tension. The castles had become problems to solve, rather than assets to maintain. Castles belonging to rebellious nobles faced slighting as punishment and warning. When a lord rebelled and lost, destroying his castle eliminated both his military capability and his visible symbol of power. The ruin stood as permanent testimony to the consequences of rebellion, a warning to other nobles considering similar actions. This wasn't just military pragmatism, but political theatre, with the shattered fortifications serving as a stage for displaying royal power. Archaeological evidence reveals slighting in ways that documents don't always capture. Excavations find the distinctive traces of deliberate demolition. Mine shafts dug to undermine foundations, showing direction and purpose inconsistent with natural collapse. Stone distribution patterns reveal controlled demolition rather than gradual decay, with rubble concentrated in areas suggesting specific destruction sequences. Scorch marks on walls indicate fires set deliberately to weaken structures before pulling them down. Some ruins show evidence of explosive force. Stones displaced outward from towers, fracture patterns consistent with blast pressure. Debris fields spreading in directions that only explosive demolition would produce. These physical traces let archaeologists distinguish between ruins created by time and neglect and ruins created by deliberate military action. The castle didn't fall, it was pushed. Corfe Castle in Dorset provides perhaps the most dramatic example. When parliamentarian forces took this royalist stronghold in 1646, they used 200 barrels of gunpowder to ensure it would never threaten anyone again. The explosions were so powerful, they knocked the massive keep off its foundations, leaving it tilted at an angle that seems to defy gravity. Nearly 4 centuries later, it remains frozen in its moment of destruction, leaning impossibly, a permanent monument to that single day of calculated violence. The effect is almost surreal. The tower didn't collapse into rubble. It shifted, cracked, but remained partially standing, caught forever mid-fall. Visitors describe feeling disoriented looking at it, their architectural expectations violated by this frozen moment of destruction. That disorientation is part of the point. The ruin isn't meant to be comfortable or natural. It's meant to disturb, to demonstrate that even the most solid structures can be unmade by sufficient force and will. This reveals something crucial about castle ruins. When we visit these sites, admiring their romantic decay and picturesque collapse, we're often looking at monuments to political violence and deliberate destruction. The broken walls and tumbled towers aren't evidence of time's gentle work, but of armies methodically erasing military capability. The aesthetic we find so appealing, the dramatic partial ruin, the walls broken just so, often reflects the surgical precision of military engineers whose goal was permanent strategic demolition. Slighting was expensive and labor-intensive. It required resources, expertise, and time. The fact that authorities invested in this destruction reveals how seriously they took the threat of fortification. A castle, even one you controlled, represented potential future danger. It could be garrisoned by rebels, occupied by foreign forces, used as a stronghold for resistance. Destroying it permanently was worth the cost, because it eliminated possibilities, closing down potential futures where that fortress might threaten the current order. The practice also reveals anxiety about military technology and changing warfare. By the 17th century, castles were becoming obsolete against artillery, but they could still be useful for small forces holding out against larger ones, for controlling territory during occupation, for providing strongpoints in guerrilla resistance. Slighting was partly about preventing these uses, but it was also about accelerating obsolescence, actively removing medieval fortifications from the modern military landscape. The psychology of slighting went beyond pure military calculation. There was something almost ritual about it, the deliberate breaking of a symbol of power, the public demonstration that no strength was permanent. The work was often witnessed by local populations who watched their lord's fortress systematically destroyed, stone by stone or in explosive moments. The message wasn't subtle. Power structures you thought permanent could be unmade. Authority you thought absolute could be overthrown and demolished. Today, when we visit slighted castles, we're walking through landscapes of political violence that have been aestheticized by time. The jagged walls and shattered towers that seem so romantically ruined in afternoon light are actually frozen moments of deliberate destruction, monuments to civil war and power struggle. Understanding slighting transforms how we see these places. They're not naturally decayed, but deliberately broken. Not gentle ruins, but violent statements that have lasted centuries beyond the conflict that created them. After the violence of slighting came something quieter, but equally destructive. Abandoned castles became convenient stone quarries, thousands of pre-cut blocks waiting to be harvested by anyone with the need and the means to carry them away. The process lasted centuries. It was gradual, legal, and economically rational. It was also devastatingly thorough. The economics was straightforward. Quarrying new stone required locating suitable deposits, cutting blocks from bedrock, shaping them to usable dimensions, and transporting them to building sites. Each stage demanded skilled labor, specialized tools, and significant time. A ruined castle eliminated most of these steps. The stones were already cut, already shaped, often already dressed with flat surfaces ideal for construction. They were simply sitting there, unused, waiting. For anyone building a house or barn or wall, the choice was obvious. Castle owners sometimes recognized this economic value and sold it. Demolition rights could be auctioned, granting buyers permission to remove stones for a fee. Local authorities issued licenses, regulating the quarrying to prevent dangerous collapses or complete destruction of structures that still served as landmarks. Account books record these transactions matter-of-factly, listing castle stone sales alongside timber and livestock, treating medieval fortifications as another harvestable resource. The same qualities that made castles militarily formidable made them valuable quarries. Thick walls meant enormous quantities of stone. Quality construction meant blocks that had already survived centuries and would last centuries more. Castles were built to endure, and that durability translated directly into material value. The better constructed the castle, the more efficiently it could be dismantled and reused. French chateaux experienced systematic removal during and after the Revolution, when feudal symbols became ideologically problematic and practically useful. Revolutionary authorities approved the dismantling of aristocratic fortifications, and their stones built schools, civic buildings, and roads that served the new political order. The transformation was literal. Stone that once symbolized feudal oppression became the physical fabric of republican infrastructure. Former lords' fortresses literally became the people's institution. Scottish Highland castles faced similar fates as rural populations needed building materials and saw no reason to preserve in increasingly irrelevant fortifications. Villages grew using castle stone, cottage by cottage, until only the most inaccessible portions of the original structures remained. The process was so thorough that some castles can only be located through archaeological survey, every removable stone having been carried away. English castles show perhaps the most extensive quarrying. In some regions, locals removed everything that could be moved, leaving only foundations and the larger structural elements that required more effort to demolish than they were worth. One Midlands village church was constructed entirely from a nearby castle over the course of several decades. The castle gradually disappeared while the church took shape, the stones simply relocating a mile down the road. The castle is now barely traceable archaeologically. The church stands solid and functional, its medieval military stones repurposed for Christian worship. This created strange redistributions of material. Walk through certain English, French, or German villages, and you're seeing castle stone everywhere. In cottage walls, garden boundaries, bridge supports, church foundations. The castle didn't vanish. It dispersed, fragment by fragment, into the surrounding landscape. Buildings miles from any castle contain distinctively castle-style stonework. Their origins visible only to architectural historians who recognize construction techniques or occasionally spot fragments of carved decorations. The social dimension adds complexity to what might otherwise be a simple story of resource extraction. In many cases, locals removing castle stones were reclaiming materials from structures that had represented oppression. The feudal lord's fortress, symbol of his power to tax, conscript, and judge, was being dismantled by the very people it had dominated. Their cottages, literally built from the lord's walls, represented a practical form of justice. Power structures don't just fall. Sometimes they're carried away stone by stone and rebuilt into housing for ordinary people. Archaeological evidence maps this removal in patterns that tell stories. Excavations reveal distinctive cutting marks where stones were pried from walls, showing how quarriers worked systematically along courses, removing the most accessible blocks first. Local records document stone purchases, creating paper trails that connect surviving buildings to vanished castles. Architectural surveys identify castle stonework in churches, manor houses, and farm buildings, tracing the diaspora of material across regions. The quarrying destroyed valuable evidence selectively, which makes the archaeological loss particularly acute. Finely worked stones with carved decorations, architectural details, or inscriptions were most desirable for reuse. They were already finished surfaces, requiring no additional work. Builders prized them and removed them first. This means the most archaeologically interesting elements, the carved capitals, decorated doorways, window tracery, heraldic panels, disappeared preferentially, taken away to ornament buildings whose owners didn't care about or understand their historical significance. Some castles lost more than 90% of their original stone volume to this gradual quarrying. What remains isn't a representative sample, but the leftovers. The stones too large to move easily, too deeply embedded to extract efficiently, or too damaged to be useful. We're seeing what nobody wanted, which creates a systematically biased archaeological record. The finest work, the most decorated elements, the stones that would tell us most about craftsmanship and artistic taste are gone, scattered through villages and towns where they're no longer recognizable as castle components. The process reveals how societies value, or don't value, their architectural heritage. For centuries, castles were seen not as monuments deserving preservation, but as resources to be exploited. The past was less important than the present, and present needs required building materials. This wasn't vandalism in any meaningful sense. It was practical adaptation, communities making use of what was available. Some removal happened within living memory of the castle's occupation. Before anyone thought of these structures as historical monuments requiring protection, the line between maintained building and harvestable ruin could be surprisingly thin. A castle might be inhabited in one generation, partially abandoned in the next, and being quarried in the third. The shift from living space to dead resource occurred faster than modern preservation instincts would consider possible. The irony persists in the landscape. Castles that were built to last forever, constructed with massive stones and military-grade durability, survived centuries of weather and warfare only to be efficiently dismantled by people who simply needed building materials. The strength that made them impressive fortifications made them valuable quarries. They were too well built for their own preservation, too useful to be left alone. As castles ceased being functional military and residential structures, they found a new purpose that was almost more destructive than abandonment. They became stages for fantasies about an imagined medieval world, props in cultural narratives that had virtually nothing to do with the historical reality they supposedly represented. The Romantic movement of the 18th and 19th centuries didn't just reinterpret castles, it rewrote them entirely, creating myths so powerful they still dominate popular understanding today. Romantic poets, artists, and novelists needed tools to be mysterious, atmospheric, and emotionally resonant in very specific ways. They wanted dramatic silhouettes is against moody skies, ivy-covered walls suggesting beautiful decay, towers that implied imprisoned maidens and tragic love stories. They wanted settings for narratives about noble knights, courtly romance, and a picturesque past where class hierarchies seemed natural and just rather than violently maintained. What they didn't want was evidence of the mundane, the ugly, or the exploitative. This aesthetic demand led to active transformation of actual castle sites. Owners who recognized the cultural and economic value of properly romantic ruins hired architects to make their properties more atmospherically decayed. The work was paradoxical, carefully managing deterioration, adding strategic damages, enhancing the look of authentic age while preventing actual collapse. Some added fake medieval features that had never existed, decorative battlements on buildings that were never defensive, Gothic windows inserted into walls that originally had smaller openings, false arrow slits positioned for visual effect rather than military function. The most extreme examples involved building entirely new medieval structures. William Beckford's Fonthill Abbey, constructed starting in 1796, exemplified the approach. It looked medieval, with a tower that briefly held the distinction of being the tallest building in England. It had everything a romantic castle should have: secret passages, hidden chambers, atmospheric spaces designed to evoke mystery and wonder. None of these features reflected actual medieval architecture. They were fantasy elements, theatrical designs meant to produce specific emotional responses. The building was a stage set disguised as history, and it was enormously influential in shaping what people expected castles to look like. Genuine medieval castles underwent Victorian restoration that was often more destructive than helpful. Architects working in the Gothic revival style believed they understood what medieval builders intended better than the medieval builders themselves. They removed features they considered crude or insufficiently decorative. They added ornamentation based on their romantic assumptions rather than historical evidence. They regularized irregular elements, making walls straighter and windows more uniform, erasing the evidence of organic growth and pragmatic modification that characterized actual medieval construction. Some restorations destroyed authentic medieval work to replace it with Victorian fantasy. Original features that didn't match romantic expectations were removed and replaced with elements that looked more medieval, according to 19th century taste rather than historical accuracy. The result was buildings that had lost their genuine medieval character while gaining an invented aesthetic that modern tourists still read as authentically old. Maintained ruins presented another category of transformation. Some castle owners recognized that ruins could be valuable tourist attractions if properly managed. They didn't fully preserve the structures, which would have eliminated the romantic decay aesthetic. But they didn't allow complete collapse either. Instead, they carefully maintained ruins at a particular stage of picturesque deterioration, removing vegetation that might actually cause damage while leaving ivy that looked appropriately atmospheric, stabilizing walls that might fall while leaving them appearing precariously ancient. This created landscapes of managed fantasy. The ruins looked natural, but were actually carefully curated to match cultural expectations about what romantic decay should look like. Tourists could experience the thrill of encountering ancient, abandoned places while actually visiting well-maintained theatrical sets. The authentic experience being sold was actually highly artificial, an invented aesthetic masquerading as historical encounter. The cultural narratives this romantic rewriting created became extraordinarily powerful. Literature, poetry, and eventually tourism materials established firm ideas about what happened in castles. Knights defended honor, ladies waited in towers, troubadours sang of courtly love, and noble lords governed justly. These narratives emphasized feudal hierarchy as natural and appropriate, presented medieval violence as glorious rather than brutal, and completely erased the experiences of the vast majority of castle occupants, the servants, laborers, and commoners, whose work supported aristocratic luxury. This erasure was ideological, not accidental. Romantic castle narratives appeared during periods of significant social tension, when industrial capitalism was disrupting traditional class structures and creating new forms of exploitation. The medieval past, reimagined as a time of natural hierarchy and mutual obligation, offered a comforting fantasy to aristocrats anxious about their declining power, and to middle-class audiences drawn to stories about noble bloodlines and inherited superiority. The ugly realities of feudalism, the violence, exploitation, and rigid class oppression disappeared from these romantic versions, replaced by aestheticized nobility and picturesque tradition. Tourists visiting castles expected to encounter this fantasy, and were disappointed when confronted with mundane historical reality. They wanted mysterious atmospheres and tragic romance, not information about sanitation systems or grain storage. Tourism operators learned to emphasize ghost stories and legendary lovers, while minimizing discussion of account books and agricultural labor. The fantasy sold better than reality, so fantasy became the dominant narrative. This created a peculiar situation where invented 19th century fantasy became more culturally influential than documented medieval history. What people know about castles, from popular culture, casual tourism, and general education, comes primarily from romantic reimagining rather than historical evidence. The image of the medieval castle in the popular imagination is essentially a Victorian invention, a theatrical performance of an imagined past that has become more real, in cultural terms, than the actual past it supposedly represents. Educational materials for children, entertainment media, and even some historical tourism still reproduce these romantic narratives, perpetuating fantasies created 2 centuries ago. Knights are presented as uniformly noble, ladies as uniformly beautiful and refined, castles as places of honor and romance rather than centers of military power and economic extraction. The invented past has colonized the actual past so thoroughly that recovering authentic castle history requires actively stripping away layers of romantic mythology that have become deeply embedded in cultural consciousness. The irony cuts deep. In some cases, authentic medieval structures were literally destroyed to build Victorian fantasy castles that looked more medieval. Real history was demolished to construct monuments to imagined history. The tower built in 1823 to look romantically ruined replaced an actual medieval barn whose genuine historical value was irrelevant compared to the aesthetic desires of a wealthy owner who wanted his estate to match his fantasies about the past. Beneath castle courtyards that have been walked over for centuries, inside walls that appear solid to the eye, hidden under vegetation that has grown for decades, there exists another layer of castle architecture that remained invisible until very recently. New technologies are revealing this hidden world without breaking a single stone, allowing researchers to see through earth and walls and time in ways that would have seemed like magic just a generation ago. Ground-penetrating radar sends electromagnetic pulses into the earth and measures what bounces back, creating images of what lies buried beneath the surface. When archaeologists scan castle grounds with GPR, they discover foundations of buildings whose above-ground portions vanished centuries ago, walls that extend far beyond what's visible, voids that suggest cellars and tunnels no one remembered existed. The technology doesn't require excavation. It reads the ground like a book, revealing chapters of architectural history that physical digging would take years to uncover and would inevitably destroy in the process of discovering. The results can be startling. A 2018 scan beneath a Scottish castle's courtyard, a space that had been walked over thousands of times, that people assumed held nothing of interest, revealed a perfectly preserved medieval kitchen 15 feet underground. The radar showed ovens, work tables, storage areas, and what appeared to be hundreds of objects still in place. The kitchen hadn't collapsed or been destroyed. It had been deliberately buried intact sometime in the 17th century, filled with earth and sealed. No documentary evidence explained why. No local tradition remembered it existed. But there it was. A complete working space frozen in time, waiting beneath centuries of foot traffic. LiDAR technology takes revelation in a different direction. Mounted on aircraft or drones, LiDAR scanners fire millions of laser pulses at the ground, some of which penetrate vegetation to hit the earth beneath. The resulting data creates detailed topographic maps that reveal subtle earthworks, invisible to human observers walking the same ground. Applied to castle landscapes, LiDAR shows defensive ditches that have been filled and ploughed over, outer walls whose stones were removed, but whose foundations left slight depressions and entire complexes of associated buildings that traditional survey methods never detected. Castles that appeared to stand in isolation turn out to have been centers of substantial settlements. The landscape around them, which looks like natural rolling countryside, reveals itself as intensely modified terrain full of human construction. Defensive earthworks extend much farther than anyone suspected. Agricultural terraces and field systems show how castle communities managed their land. Roads and paths create networks connecting structures that no longer stand but whose positions remain legible in the subtle topography that LiDAR makes visible. Thermal imaging offers another form of sight. Different materials retain and release heat at different rates. A wall that appears uniform to the eye might show temperature variations that reveal internal differences. Blocked passages, sealed chambers, areas where different construction materials were used, or where modern repairs hide older features. Researchers scan castle walls with thermal cameras, watching for anomalies that suggest hidden spaces. A Welsh castle yielded one of the most remarkable discoveries through this method. Thermal imaging detected a density difference in what appeared to be solid wall. Investigation revealed a sealed room deliberately blocked off that contained 14th century documents, household accounts, personal letters, and legal records that had been hidden or forgotten and accidentally preserved by the ceiling. The room hadn't been entered in more than 600 years. Without thermal imaging, it might never have been found. The documents decaying unknown inside their stone envelope. Three-dimensional laser scanning creates digital models of extraordinary precision, recording every surface detail of castle architecture down to millimeter accuracy. These scans serve multiple purposes. They create permanent records, preserving the exact current state of structures that continue to decay, ensuring that even if the physical building deteriorates further, its 21st century condition is preserved digitally. They allow researchers to examine architecture from any angle, zooming in on details or pulling back to see overall patterns, detecting subtle alignments and modifications that are invisible when you're standing in the actual space. The scans reveal how castles were modified over time, showing where walls were added or removed, where window openings were enlarged or blocked, where floors were raised or lowered. Each change represents a decision made by earlier occupants, and the accumulated changes tell stories about evolving needs, changing technologies, and shifting social arrangements. The digital models make these architectural biographies readable in ways that physical inspection alone cannot achieve. Digital photography using different light spectrums reveals another hidden layer. Infrared and ultraviolet light make visible what normal light conceals. Walls that appear blank under regular lighting show traces of painted decorations, graffiti, smoke damage patterns, or evidence of tapestries and hangings long since removed. Faded inscriptions become legible again. Colors that have bleached to invisibility reappear when photographed in the right spectrum. One dramatic example involved a great hall whose plastered walls had been painted white centuries ago, covering whatever decorations had existed before. Multispectral photography revealed an entire program of late medieval wall paintings underneath. Scenes of hunting, heraldic displays, decorative borders that had been hidden but not destroyed by the later whitewash. The paintings had been there all along, invisible, waiting for the right technology to make them perceptible again. Even more exotic technologies find applications. CT scanning and X-ray analysis, adapted from medical imaging, can examine what's inside walls without opening them. This reveals internal structures, shows how walls were constructed, detects voids or objects sealed within masonry, and identifies different building materials that might indicate modifications or repairs. The wall becomes transparent, its interior construction and contents readable without destructive investigation. These technologies transform archaeological practice fundamentally. Traditional excavation is slow, expensive, and inherently destructive. You can only dig once, and you destroy what you're investigating in the process of learning about it. Non-destructive technologies allow rapid survey of large areas, repeated investigation as methods improve, and preservation of sites for future study using techniques we haven't yet invented. The digital records created today become resources for researchers decades or centuries from now, who will be able to examine our scans and potentially extract information we don't yet know how to read. This technological revolution has coincided with a shift in historical priorities that makes it especially powerful. Modern historians are interested in precisely the kinds of details that earlier generations ignored or deliberately erased. The lives of servants and workers, women's experiences and contributions, economic activity and daily routines, the mundane material reality of castle life, rather than just dramatic political events and military exploits. Earlier historians had little interest in finding buried kitchens or reconstructing servant quarters. Contemporary researchers actively seek this evidence, asking questions that require exactly the kind of data these new technologies provide. The combination creates an unprecedented moment for castle archaeology. The tools exist to reveal hidden structures and spaces. The interpretive frameworks exist to understand what those discoveries mean. The institutional and funding priorities exist to support research into aspects of castle life that were forgotten or deliberately erased. We're living through a golden age of rediscovery, where centuries of loss and erasure are being reversed, where technologies let us see what was hidden, and where changed values make us care about what we find. Every scan reveals possibilities. Every thermal image might detect a sealed space. Every LiDAR survey might uncover lost landscapes. The castles we thought we understood are turning out to hold secrets that previous generations of researchers walked past or over. Secrets that are only now becoming visible as technology gives us new ways of seeing and new priorities give us reasons to look. The Scottish kitchen lies buried still, waiting for the resources and planning required to excavate it properly. But we know it's there now. We can see its outline, understand its layout, anticipate what we might find when archaeology finally reaches it. It exists in our knowledge, even though it remains underground, brought back into memory by radar pulses that penetrated Earth and time to reveal what deliberate burial tried to hide. That's the promise of these technologies. Not just finding what's hidden, but recovering what was forgotten, making visible again what erasure tried to eliminate from history. For centuries, the vast majority of castle inhabitants existed in historical records only as categories: servants, laundresses, guards, faceless masses whose individual existences disappeared into collective terminology. But modern research is performing a different kind of archaeology. excavating individual lives from fragmentary evidence, connecting scattered pieces until specific people emerge from the anonymous crowd. These aren't famous figures or noble lords. They're the ordinary people whose names barely survived, whose lives the historical record tried to erase. Recovering them requires patience, creativity, and a willingness to treat the smallest evidence as precious. The process combines sources that earlier historians never thought to connect. A name appearing once in household accounts from the 1480s, paid to Marjorie for laundry, 2 pence, seems like nothing. An administrative detail with no historical significance. But cross-reference that name with skeletal remains from the castle cemetery, and patterns emerge. One skeleton shows bone changes, consistent with decades of washing clothes, the repetitive motion leaving permanent marks. Severe arthritis in hands and shoulders, spine deformities from carrying heavy wet textiles, chemical damage to tooth enamel from exposure to lye used in laundry. The medical evidence suggests this woman worked from childhood until death. Her body shaped by her labor in ways that remained legible in bones 6 centuries later. The skeleton's estimated age at death matches the final mention of Marjorie in the accounts, 37 years after that first payment. She wasn't just passing through. She spent her entire adult life in that castle, performing the same exhausting work that eventually destroyed her body. She wasn't a category called laundress. She was Marjorie, a specific person whose decades of labor kept the castle's textiles clean, whose hands washed the lord's clothing and the household linens, whose back bent under the weight of wet wool, and whose joints ground themselves into arthritic pain through repetitive motion, performed perhaps 8 hours daily for 40 years. DNA analysis adds another dimension to skeletal evidence. Researchers can now identify family relationships among individuals buried in castle cemeteries. A woman buried near the kitchen outbuildings and a child buried in the servants' section turn out to be mother and daughter. Their genetic relationship connecting two otherwise isolated individuals. A group of men buried in the guard quarters show familial DNA markers, suggesting military service passed through family lines, sons following fathers into castle defense. Graffiti provides unexpected biographical detail. A page named Thomas carved his name in 3 locations within a single castle, each carving in a different area. The first, dated 1492, appears in the lowest servant quarters. The second, from 1501, marks a middle-level room where household staff of modest rank lived. The third, dated 1507, appears near chambers occupied by senior household officials. The progression is visible. Thomas rose through the household hierarchy over 15 years, his graffiti marking his social ascent in the only record he could create himself. He left his autobiography in carved initials, 3 data points that track an individual career, otherwise completely undocumented. Tool caches reveal working lives in unexpected detail. A smith's hidden collection of tools and partially finished work, concealed for reasons now lost, perhaps during a threat that never materialized, shows his range of expertise. Analysis of the tools reveals what he made: decorative ironwork for furniture, practical hinges and locks, weapons maintenance equipment, cooking implements. The tools show wear patterns indicating which tasks he performed most frequently. Metal analysis of partially finished pieces reveals his techniques and material choices. We can't recover his name from this cache, but we can reconstruct significant portions of his working life. understanding his skills and daily activity with remarkable precision. Medical records occasionally provide windows into individual experiences. A cook, whose treatment appears in unusually detailed household accounts, suffered from severe burn scars, respiratory problems from years of smoke exposure, and recurring infections from cuts that came with knife work. The records exist only because she was valuable. The castle lord paid for her medical care, including expensive treatments, because her culinary expertise was difficult to replace. The records treating her as property paradoxically preserve details of her suffering and her physical decline. She was valuable enough to be worth healing, but not important enough to be remembered as a person. The accounts give her medical history, but not her thoughts, her relationships, her inner life. Yet even these fragments create something closer to biography than category. A woman buried in a castle cemetery shows skeletal evidence of at least 6 childbirths, severe childhood malnutrition that stunted her growth, and an infected hand injury that killed her around age 40. Cross-referencing with account books yields a single appearance: Agnes, laundress. That's everything the historical record preserved. But now we know more. We know Agnes survived a malnourished childhood, probably born into poverty. We know she bore multiple children while working as a laundress, managing simultaneous demands of childcare and labor. We know she died from an infected wound, probably a work injury, her body too weakened by years of hard labor to fight off infection. We know her name was Agnes. Modern researchers report emotional responses to these connections, finding documentary evidence that corresponds to skeletal remains, finally giving a name to bones that had been catalogued only by excavation numbers can be overwhelming. Researchers describe crying when they connect evidence. When someone who died forgotten and anonymous 500 years ago suddenly exists again as an individual with a name and a story. It's not sentiment. It's recognition of ethical responsibility. These were people, and they deserved to be remembered as people, not as statistical data or categorical abstractions. The work continues. Databases now track name appearances across multiple household accounts, following individuals as they move between castles and lords over their careers. Some servants worked for the same family across decades, appearing in records from different properties as the household relocated. Others moved between employers, their names surfacing briefly in different accounts before disappearing again. Each appearance is a glimpse, a moment when they became visible to record keepers. Connecting those glimpses creates something approaching biography. Every unnamed person in castle history was someone with parents and possibly children, with skills they'd learned and work they performed daily, with physical bodies that bore the marks of their labor and their lives, with thoughts and feelings and relationships we'll never recover, but which were as real and complex as anyone's today. They lived full human lives that documentary erasure tried to eliminate from memory. Our current task isn't just acknowledging they existed, but recovering as many individual lives as possible, giving names and stories back to people whose existence was reduced to categories or erased entirely. Agnes existed, Marjorie existed, Thomas existed, the nameless Smith existed. Each was a specific person, irreplaceable, unique, who lived through decades of experience that the historical record compressed into nothing or nearly nothing. Finding them again, piecing together their lives from scattered fragments, restoring their individuality against centuries of categorical erasure. This is the work of recovery, the attempt to undo historical injustice by the only means available to us. Remembering. We can reconstruct a medieval castle sewage system down to the angle of the drainage pipes. We can account for every penny spent on candles in a particular household over a particular winter. Modern archaeology can even determine what graffiti was carved on which wall and make reasonable guesses about the day it was made. But we have no idea what a tired laundress hummed to herself while working in the cold morning hours. We never will. Some things time erases completely, and no amount of modern technology or changed priorities can bring them back. The emotional and psychological lives of Gazil inhabitants remain largely opaque. We can know what people did. The documents tell us that. We can trace their movements, their purchases, their formal obligations, their presence at specific events. But we rarely know why they did what they did. We almost never know how they felt about it. Did the night watchman resent his cold rounds or take pride in his responsibility? Did the kitchen staff feel camaraderie or bitter rivalry? Did the noble lady looking out her chamber window feel trapped or protected? The actions survived in records. The feelings died with the people who experienced them. Millions of hours of conversation happened in these castles. People talked while they worked, while they ate, while they walked from one room to another. They gossiped and complained and joked and confided. They shared fears and hopes and stories. Almost none of it was written down. The conversations that do appear in documents are formal ones, official exchanges, legal proceedings. The actual texture of daily talk, the rhythm and content of ordinary human communication left virtually no trace. We're looking at a world where nearly everyone was constantly talking, and we're essentially deaf to it. Personal relationships between individuals remain mysterious. We can sometimes determine that two people knew each other or worked together, but who loved whom? Who aided whom? Who trusted whom with secrets? Which friendships were genuine and which were strategic? Family relationships appear in genealogies, but those tell us nothing about whether a father and son actually liked each other, or whether siblings maintained bonds into adulthood. The emotional geography of castle life, the invisible network of affection and animosity that shaped every interaction, is mostly lost. Children's experiences are particularly elusive. Children rarely appear in documents, and when they do, it's usually only noble children at significant moments like births, betrothals, or inheritance. The castle must have been full of children. Servants had children. Workers had children. These children grew up in castle spaces, played in corners we can still visit, learned the rhythms of castle life. But their games, their fears, their observations, their actual lived experience, gone. We can't recover childhood from below the noble class with any specificity or confidence. Decision-making processes remain opaque even when we can see outcomes clearly. A lord decided to renovate a particular room or hire a specific person or change a long-standing practice. We see the result. We rarely understand how the decision was made. Who was consulted? What alternatives were considered? What factors mattered most? Did this outcome reflect careful deliberation or impulse or pressure from someone else? The visible historical record shows us what happened, but rarely shows us why. Temporary workers and visitors passed through castles constantly. Traveling merchants, messengers, craftsmen hired for specific projects, entertainers, pilgrims seeking shelter. These people saw castle life from unique perspectives. They noticed things permanent residents no longer consciously registered. They made comparisons to other castles they'd visited. They formed impressions and opinions. And then they left, taking their observations with them into oblivion. The transient population was significant, but it's nearly invisible in surviving evidence. Leisure and entertainment for common people present similar mysteries. We know certain activities occurred. We have evidence of games, music, storytelling, but we rarely understand the cultural meanings attached to these activities, or how people actually experienced them. Was a particular song considered funny or sad? Did a certain game carry social significance? What made one story memorable and another forgettable? The activities survived as bare facts. The meaning died. The subjective experience of castle spaces is perhaps the most tantalizing gap. We can walk through reconstructed or preserved castles today. We can measure the rooms and examine the architecture. But how did these spaces feel to the people who lived in them? Which areas felt safe or dangerous? Which rooms felt comfortable or oppressive? Did the Great Hall feel impressive or intimidating? Did narrow corridors feel cozy or claustrophobic? Different people surely experienced the same spaces differently, and almost none of that subjective reality was recorded. These gaps exist for clear reasons. Certain types of experience don't leave physical traces. A feeling, a conversation, a relationship. These are real and important, but they don't create archaeological evidence or written records. Emotional and subjective content is nearly impossible to recover without direct testimony, and most people never gave such testimony. Children, temporary workers, servants, and other marginal groups were beneath the threshold of documentation. Their lives seemed too ordinary, too unimportant, to warrant recording. Historians work with these gaps through careful inference and honest acknowledgement of uncertainty. We can make educated guesses based on human nature and circumstantial evidence. But we acknowledge when we're guessing. We resist the temptation to invent convenient answers just to fill silence. We remember that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Just because we can't recover something doesn't mean it wasn't important or didn't exist. These persistent mysteries should make us humble. Our picture of castle life, even with modern techniques and changed priorities, remains fundamentally incomplete. We've recovered remarkable amounts of forgotten history, but much remains forever lost. The people we're trying to recover knew countless things we'll never discover. They lived in a world far richer and more complex than the fragments we can reconstruct. The forgetting wasn't an accident. It was the entire point. A castle was meant to project an image of noble power, elegant living, a military might, showing the 300 people working in the shadows. Maintaining that illusion would have destroyed the illusion. So they were designed into the architecture as invisible. They were forgotten on purpose, starting the moment they began working there. At the individual level, people forget what doesn't seem important to them. The nobles who lived in castles and had the literacy, resources, and authority to create written records simply didn't think servants' lives were worth documenting. This wasn't necessarily cruelty, though it could be. It was something more fundamental and more insidious. They considered those lives inherently less significant. A servant's daily routine, feelings, family relationships, and personal struggles just didn't register as the kind of thing that belonged in permanent record. The assumption was so deep, it was barely conscious. You document what matters. Servants didn't matter in the way that nobles mattered. Therefore, you don't document servants. The logic was circular and complete. At the institutional level, record keeping served specific purposes. Documents existed to support law, establish property ownership, track financial obligations, and demonstrate power relationships. These functions excluded most of daily life automatically. A transaction involving money or land generated a record. A conversation between two servants generated nothing. An administrative decision by a castle steward might be noted. The work a laundress did on a particular Tuesday disappeared the moment it was completed. Institutions preserved what served institutional purposes. Everything else was considered temporary, disposable beneath the threshold of documentation. At the economic level, maintaining and remembering buildings requires resources. When castles lost their economic and military value, usually during the transition from medieval to early modern periods, they became expensive problems rather than strategic assets. Some were maintained by families wealthy enough to afford the upkeep and attached enough to the ancestral home to justify the cost. Many others were simply allowed to decay. Stone was scavenged for other building projects. Rooms were repurposed. Entire wings were demolished or abandoned. The buildings that housed servants and supported their work were typically the first to go because they seemed least important and least worth preserving. Economic calculation reinforced social hierarchy. Save the Great Hall, let the servants' quarters collapse. At the political level, successive regimes had reasons to suppress or rewrite castle histories that didn't serve their narratives. A new ruling family might want to minimize the accomplishments of the previous occupants. A government transitioning away from feudal power structures might want to present castles as obsolete relics rather than sophisticated administrative centers. Revolutionary movements had incentives to emphasize the oppression and waste of castle life while ignoring its complexities, and each regime that came to power inherited castles built by people they wanted to distance themselves from. And allowing certain aspects of castle history to be forgotten served those political purposes. At the cultural level, romantic fantasy became more appealing than complex, messy historical reality. By the Victorian era, castles had been transformed in popular imagination into settings for noble romance, chivalric virtue, and aesthetic beauty. This fantasy version was enormously popular and culturally powerful. It influenced art, literature, architecture, and eventually film. The fantasy didn't include servants' quarters or latrine chutes, or the brutal logistics of keeping hundreds of people fed and warm. Including those elements would have made the fantasy less appealing, less coherent, less satisfying. So cultural production, which shapes what people remember and care about, systematically reinforce, forgetting the aspects of castle life that contradicted the romantic narrative. These erasures were rarely conspiracies. They didn't require coordinated effort or explicit decisions to hide information. They were the predictable outcome of power structures operating normally. People with the power to create and preserve records documented what mattered to them, which was primarily other powerful people and the transactions between them. The lives of people without power left fewer traces, not because those lives were less complex, less emotional, or less important to the people living them, but because recording and preservation themselves are acts requiring resources and authority. You need literacy to write. You need materials to write on. You need institutions to store and maintain documents. You need people in future generations who consider your documents worth preserving. At every step, these requirements filtered out the lives of ordinary people. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. The more completely a population is erased from history, the easier it becomes to forget they existed at all. Once they're forgotten, their continued erasure seems natural and unimportant. Why would we look for evidence of servant spaces if we've internalized the idea that castles were just homes for nobles and their families? Why would we question the absence of certain documents if we've never expected those documents to exist? The erasure becomes invisible. It stops being something done to people and becomes just the way history is. Physical and documentary destruction work together. Buildings that supported servants' work were demolished and or repurposed, removing the physical evidence that might have prompted questions about who worked where and how. Simultaneously, the documents that might have described that work were never created in the first place or weren't considered worth preserving when later archivists decided what to keep and what to discard. Someone sorting through medieval documents in the 18th century, faced with limited storage space and operating within their own cultural assumptions about whose lives mattered, would naturally preserve charters and legal documents and noble correspondence, while discarding household accounts and servants' records. Both the buildings and the documents disappeared, leaving historians with almost nothing to work from. Forgetting isn't passive. It's not what happens when you simply stop paying attention. Forgetting is active, structural, and reflects whose lives society considered important at every moment of history, from the medieval period through today. The castle servants were forgotten because people with power to shape memory decided, consciously or unconsciously, that they weren't worth remembering. The architecture was forgotten because it served functions that contradicted preferred narratives about what castles were. The documents were forgotten because institutional priorities valued certain types of information over others. At every point, forgetting was something done by people making choices shaped by the power structures they inhabited. Every time we recover a forgotten servant's name, a hidden room's purpose, or a woman's documented work, we're not just doing archaeology. We're refusing to accept that some people matter more than others. Every recovery is an argument about human worth made across centuries. There's an ethical dimension to this work that goes beyond simple curiosity about the past. Recovering forgotten lives is a form of belated recognition and respect. These people lived full, complex human lives. They worked, loved, struggled, hoped, and died. They were denied historical presence during their lifetimes because the people with power to record history didn't consider them worth recording. Recovery gives them back what was taken from them. It says, belatedly but genuinely, that their lives mattered, that they deserved to be remembered, that their erasure was wrong. It's a kind of justice, centuries delayed, incomplete and imperfect, but justice nonetheless. The epistemological implications run deeper than they might initially appear. Recovering hidden castle history reveals that official history is incomplete and biased. It teaches us to question narratives and look for whose voices are missing from any story we're told. Once you understand how completely servants were erased from castle history, you start asking similar questions about every historical narrative. Who built this? Who maintained it? Whose labor made this possible? Whose perspective isn't being represented? This skepticism is a tool that applies far beyond medieval castles. It's a way of reading history, and by extension, reading the present, that assumes invisibility rather than accepting it as natural. The contemporary relevance is unavoidable. Patterns of erasure in medieval castles mirror modern erasures. The people whose work sustains contemporary institutions are often invisible in exactly the same way servants were invisible in castles. Janitors, food service workers, maintenance staff, security guards. They make buildings function, but they're designed to be unnoticed. They rarely appear in official histories of the institutions they serve. They're below the threshold of documentation in the same structural way medieval servants were. Understanding historical invisibility helps us recognize who is being erased from contemporary history as it's being made. The patterns haven't changed as much as we might like to believe. There are cultural and identity dimensions that matter deeply to many people. Recovering servant history, women's history, and working class history allows modern people from those backgrounds to find ancestors and connection to the past they've been told they don't have. The popular understanding of medieval history is noble history. If your ancestors weren't nobles, the implicit message has been that you don't have medieval ancestors worth knowing about. Recovery work challenges that. It says your ancestors were there. They were essential. They had skills, knowledge, and experiences worth understanding and respecting. For people who've been told their family history doesn't matter or doesn't connect to the grand sweep of history, recovery creates connection and inheritance. The emotional and human dimensions are perhaps the most immediate. There's profound satisfaction in making the invisible visible, in giving names and stories to people who were meant to be forgotten, in resisting the idea that some lives don't matter or that history is only about the powerful. Every recovered detail feels like a small victory against erasure. Every identified servant's name or reconstructed servant's space or understood servant's skill represents pushing back against centuries of indifference. It's resistance that happens through scholarship and archaeology and careful reading of documents. But it's resistance nonetheless. This recovery work has practical implications that extend into the present. It changes what we preserve and how we interpret historic sites. Castles open to the public increasingly include servant spaces, an interpretation of servants' work, because recovery has shown those spaces and that work existed and mattered. It influences whose stories get told in education. Curricula are slowly expanding to include social history alongside political history, partly because recovered evidence makes social history possible to teach. It affects how we understand social structures and historical change. Once you understand how fossils actually functioned, you understand feudal society differently, and it shapes how we think about whose lives matter in the present. Historical recovery is always implicitly an argument about value and attention and respect. Castle history recovery connects to broader intellectual and cultural movements. History from below centers ordinary people's experiences, rather than assuming that history happens only when powerful people make decisions. Social history examines daily life, material culture, and lived experience rather than just political events and military campaigns. Public history makes scholarly research accessible and relevant to general audiences who aren't academics but care about the past and its meanings. These movements have transformed how professional historians work and what questions they ask. Castle recovery is part of that transformation. Recovering forgotten castle history isn't just about the past. It's about how we understand history itself. It's about whose stories we value and whose we dismiss. It's about what lessons we draw from the past to inform the present. Every time we recover something that was meant to stay forgotten, we're making an argument about human dignity and historical memory. We're saying that erasure isn't inevitable or natural. We're saying that the people who were supposed to be invisible deserve to be seen. We're saying that their lives, their work, their existence matters enough to reconstruct painstakingly from fragments. That argument echoes forward into how we think about whose lives matter now, whose work deserves recognition now, whose stories deserve telling now. The connection isn't abstract, it's direct and urgent. Every castle contains two worlds, the one designed to be seen and the one designed to remain hidden. So does your workplace. So does your city. So does your country. Now that you've learned to see the hidden world in castles, you can't unsee it everywhere else. That's the real discovery. Not what was forgotten then, but what's being forgotten right now. Most people watching this have more in common with the forgotten 90% than the documented nobility. If your ancestors lived in medieval times, they were almost certainly part of the invisible population. They were the ones working in kitchens, hauling water, maintaining fires, washing linens, repairing walls, mucking stables, carrying messages. They were the ones who made castles function while leaving almost no trace in the historical record. This entire documentary has been recovering your ancestors' lives, their experiences, their contributions. It's been offering you connection to a past you may have thought you had no stake in because the history you were taught focused on nobles and battles and political succession. But you were always there. Your people were always there. They were just designed to be invisible. That forgotten world left traces inside you, whether you realize it or not. Language you use carries words invented by working people to describe their tools and tasks. Cultural practices you maintain have roots in the survival strategies of people who endured cold nights and hard labor. Skills passed down through families, how to organize work, how to manage limited resources, how to collaborate under pressure, originated in castle kitchens and workshops and servant quarters. Even your genetics connects you to those medieval populations. The world inside you contains fragments of the world we've been recovering. You're not separate from this history. You're made of it. The power structures that created castle erasure didn't disappear. They persist in modified forms today. Who gets documented still follows patterns established centuries ago. People with wealth, status, and institutional authority leave extensive records. Their meetings are minuted. Their decisions are archived. Their lives are considered historically significant by default. People doing essential labor, cleaning buildings, preparing food, maintaining infrastructure, caring for others, still often work in near invisibility. Their contributions are acknowledged perfunctorily, if at all. Whose work is considered important, whose voices are heard, and whose contributions are erased continue to follow the same basic logic that operated in medieval castles. The technology has changed. The fundamental pattern hasn't. Understanding castle erasure provides tools for recognizing contemporary erasure. You can ask the questions now. Who's invisible in your workplace or school or community? Whose work supports the institution but goes unacknowledged? When your organization tells its story or celebrates its achievements, whose contributions get mentioned and whose get omitted? Whose perspectives are considered when decisions are made and whose are assumed not to matter? These aren't abstract historical questions. They're immediate, practical questions about the world you inhabit right now. The patterns we've traced through medieval castles are operating around you constantly. You have the ability to see them now. Knowing that erasure happens creates responsibility. You can't unknow that most people throughout history were systematically excluded from historical memory. You can't unhear the silence where their voices should be. You can't unsee the architectural tricks that hid essential work from view. That knowledge obligates you, not legally, but morally. You're responsible now for noticing and resisting erasure when you encounter it, for asking whose story isn't being told, for insisting that invisible work be acknowledged, for creating documentation where none would otherwise exist, for preserving what others consider too mundane or unimportant to bother with. The responsibility isn't comfortable, but it's real. Castles have always had two versions running simultaneously: the visible performance, grandeur, power, elegant noble life, designed for outsiders and posterity, and the hidden reality, hundreds of workers, complex logistics, uncomfortable conditions, brutal pragmatism, designed to remain unseen. Our world operates the same way. Every institution projects an official image while depending on invisible labor to maintain it. Every community has documented members and forgotten ones. Every era creates official narratives while countless lives and experiences fall below the threshold of recording. The work of seeing the hidden, naming the unnamed, and remembering the forgotten isn't something that happened once in medieval studies. It's ongoing work that every generation must do. This documentary has trained you to see past official narratives, to look for hidden spaces and ask what happened there, to notice absences in the record and wonder whose lives occupied those silences, to question whose perspective shapes the stories you're told, to recognize that invisibility is designed, not accidental. That skill applies everywhere. To the building you're sitting in right now, to the systems you participate in, to the history being made around you that future generations will try to understand from incomplete, biased evidence. You have tools now and responsibility. The people working in today's shadows won't be tomorrow's mysteries if someone notices them, documents them, insists they matter. That someone could be you. The hidden world in castles took centuries to recover because generations of historians accepted its invisibility as natural. Don't accept invisibility as natural. Not then, not now. See the second world. Remember the forgotten. Refuse to let erasure continue unchallenged. The castle you're standing in, whatever castle that might be, contains two worlds. You've learned to see both. That changes everything.